The workshop stood on Varvaka Street, not far from the frozen river, in a building whose log walls had darkened with age and smoke. Inside, the ceiling was low, supported by thick beams that ran the length of the room, and from these beams hung bundles of furs tied with twine, their pelts catching the dim light like soft shadows. A large work table dominated the center of the space, its surface worn smooth by decades of cutting and stitching, and beside it stood a stool with a sheepskin cushion. The only window looked out toward the street, but the frost had painted its small panes with a thick layer of white, so that the daylight entering the room was pale and diffuse, the color of watered milk. In one corner, a tall tiled stove radiated a steady warmth that did not quite reach the far walls, leaving the corners of the workshop in a permanent chill where breath turned to mist. The great frost of 1708 had settled over Moscow like a heavy hand, pressing the city into silence. Out on the Moskva River, the ice was so thick that sledges could cross without the faintest creak of protest, and the usual sounds of the city, the calls of street vendors, the rumble of cartwheels, the barking of dogs, were all muffled or absent entirely. Even the church bells seemed to ring with a softened tone, their clappers wrapped in cold. Snow lay in high drifts against the buildings, and the air itself felt brittle, as if it might shatter at the slightest sound. In the workshop, the stove ticked and sighed, burning birch logs that gave off a thin, sweet smoke escaping through a small iron vent, while the frost on the window crept inward in delicate, feathery patterns. The furrier, a man named Ivan, came through the low doorway from the back room where he slept, ducking his head out of long habit. He was not especially tall, but his shoulders were rounded from years of bending over his table, and his hands, when he held them up to the stove, showed a fine network of small scars and calluses earned from needle and knife. He wore a woolen shirt beneath a sleeveless coat of sheepskin, and leather boots lined with felt, and an apron of coarse linen tied at his waist. After standing for a moment before the fire, he turned to his work table and began the careful routine of setting out his tools, the same ritual he had performed each morning for more than 30 years. First he unrolled a strip of felt upon which his tools rested in individual pockets, curved needles of different sizes, a small knife with a wooden handle polished by use, a bone folder shaped like a thin paddle, a measuring cord of braided flax, a lump of beeswax, and a spool of strong linen thread. He placed these items on the table in a straight line, each an inch from the next, then tested the point of the smallest needle against the pad of his thumb before returning it to its place. The bone folder he set to the right, the wax and thread to the left, all arranged with a quiet precision that came from years of knowing exactly where every object belonged. The room held no sound but the low crackle of the fire and the dry rustle of his apron as he moved. Yesterday evening, just as the brief winter twilight had begun to fade, a servant of the boyar had arrived at the workshop door carrying a flat cedar box. The box was tied with a leather strap and wrapped in a square of unbleached linen. Inside, packed between layers of the same cloth, lay 72 Barguzin sable pelts. Ivan had taken the box with both hands, feeling its weight, and had set it on a shelf overnight, so the furs could slowly adjust to the temperature of the room. Now, in the pale morning, he lifted the box down and placed it on the work table, untying the strap and folding back the linen with the same care one might use for a sleeping child. The scent that rose from the open box was mild and sweet, a faint animal musk softened by the cedar wood. Ivan looked inside at the dark pelts arranged in neat stacks, their fur glossy even in the dim light. He began to lift them out one by one, counting under his breath. Each pelt was deep brown, nearly black, with silvery tips that caught the light and gave the fur a shimmering quality, as if a breath of frost had settled permanently among the hairs. The leather side was pale cream in color, thin and supple from expert dressing, and he ran his thumb across the surface of each one, feeling for any stiff spots or thin patches that would need to be avoided when he made his cuts. He counted the pelts slowly, mouthing the numbers as he went, until all 72 lay on the table in a long row. None were damaged. The boyar's agent had acquired prime sables from the eastern forests, animals that had lived through many winters and grown coats of extraordinary density. Ivan lifted one pelt and held it close to the window, letting the weak daylight filter through the fur. The guard hairs stood straight, and the underwool was so thick that no light passed through at all. He laid it down again and smoothed it with his palm, feeling the slight coolness of the silk-like fibers, then moved on to the next, repeating the inspection without haste. The workshop filled with a particular stillness that belonged only to the coldest days, when even the logs and the walls contracted with a soft creaking sound. The frost on the window grew thicker by the hour, its patterns branching and spreading like a slow map of the cold. Ivan worked with a steady rhythm, picking up a pelt, turning it over, studying the direction of the fur, then laying it flat and aligning it with its neighbors. His hands moved with a calm certainty born of long practice, never fumbling, never hurrying. The stove gave a sharp pop as a pocket of sap in the birch wood ignited, and a small shower of sparks fell against the iron grate behind the door, then faded. The pelts had to be sorted now. Ivan would group them by size and by the slight variations in color, matching those that would form the back of the cloak, those for the front panels, those for the sleeves and the collar. This was not work that could be rushed. A poorly matched seam would show as a line of discordant tone across the finished garment, and the boyar would notice. So Ivan stood for a long while, moving the pelts around the tabletop as if arranging pieces of a puzzle, whose final image only he could see. He paired two large pelts that were nearly identical in their silver tipping and set them apart on the left side, then two more for the front panels, then a series of medium-sized pelts with especially soft leather for the sleeves. Outside, somewhere along the street, a sled passed with a muffled hiss of runners on packed snow, and a voice called out once, then was swallowed by the cold. Ivan paused for only a moment, lifting his head, then returned to his sorting. He was not a man given to distraction. His world had shrunk over the years to the dimensions of this workshop, the length of thread, the curve of a needle, the feel of fur under his fingers. When he had grouped the pelts into 5 loose piles, he went to the stove, opened the iron door, and added 2 more logs, banking the fire so it would burn slowly through the morning. He then took a moment to prepare his hands. The cold made the skin stiff, and fine work required supple joints, so he rubbed his palms together briskly and held them over the stove's warmth until the fingertips tingled. From a shelf he lifted a small clay pot of rendered fat mixed with beeswax, a salve he made himself, and worked a tiny amount into the cracks around his knuckles before wiping his hands clean on a scrap of linen. This done, he returned to the table and began the next stage of preparation, measuring the boyar's pattern. Pinned to the wall above the table was a strip of birch bark on which the boyar's measurements had been written in charcoal: the width of the shoulders, the length of the arm, the distance from the collar seat to the back of the knee, the chest circumference at the fullest part. Ivan read these figures now and then as he unrolled a length of coarse pattern cloth, the same cloth he had used for many cloaks, marked with faint chalk lines and small notches that told him where each seam would fall. He spread the cloth on the floor, since the table was too small, and knelt beside it, smoothing out the wrinkles with the flat of his hand. Then he lifted 2 of the largest pelts and laid them lightly over the pattern, checking that the hair direction ran downward from shoulder to hem, a rule that must never be broken because sable fur worn against its grain would feel rough and look dull. The hair of a sable flows from the animal's head toward its tail, and every piece of the cloak would need to honor this natural fall. Ivan traced the direction with a fingertip, first on the pelt, then on the pattern piece, confirming the alignment. Once satisfied, he marked the leather side with a tiny stitch of red thread at the top edge of each pelt, a code that only he understood. He did this for all the pieces that would form the back panel, his needle moving in and out with a soft whisper against the leather. The red stitches were small and neat, almost invisible from the fur side, and they would be removed later after the cutting was complete. By now the morning had passed into early afternoon. The light from the window had shifted, growing a shade brighter as the sun climbed behind the clouds, but it remained pale and without warmth. Ivan's apprentice, a boy of 12 named Misha, arrived through the back door with an armful of split birch logs, his cheeks red from the cold. He stacked the wood neatly beside the stove, brushed the snow from his felt boots, and sat on a low stool in the corner without being told. Misha was a quiet boy who had been apprenticed to Ivan for 2 winters, learning the furrier's craft through watching and doing small tasks, carding wool, waxing thread, sweeping the floor. He said nothing now, only pulled a basket of wool toward him and began to card it with 2 wooden paddles, the wire teeth pulling the fibers apart into soft clouds. The gentle rasp of carding joined the other sounds of the workshop. Ivan straightened his back and looked at the pelt spread out before him. The back panel would be the largest single piece of the cloak, assembled from 6 matched sables whose pelts he would sew edge to edge. He took up a piece of charcoal and a fiber string, and on the leather side of the first pelt he drew a gentle curve, following the contour of the pattern piece. His hand was steady, the line appearing dark and sure against the pale leather. He then drew similar lines on 5 more pelts, each one cut to the same template, ensuring that when joined, they would form a smooth expanse of fur. The leather yielded softly under the charcoal, and the lines were a map for the knife that would follow tomorrow. For now, he only marked them, rolled the pattern cloth, and placed the sorted pelts back into their groups, covering them with a clean linen cloth to keep off dust. The stove hummed quietly, its tiles giving off a steady glow. The frost on the window had cracked inward so far that tiny ice crystals now hung from the inner frame, catching the firelight like minuscule gems. Misha finished carding 1 basket of wool and began another, his movements slow and regular. Ivan allowed himself to sit for a moment on his stool, hands resting on his apron. He gazed at the covered pelts, thinking of the sequence of steps to come, cutting, then sewing, then the long, painstaking work of matching seams and fluffing the fur to hide the stitches. It would take many days, perhaps 2 weeks, but the cold was not going anywhere, and the boyar was in no hurry. His steward had said as much. There was only the work, the winter, and the patient craft of making something warm and lasting. Outside, the brief afternoon began to fade toward evening, the sky deepening to a grey so heavy that the church towers vanished into it. The street became quieter still, if such a thing were possible. Someone lit a lamp in the building across the way, a small flame that flickered behind a frosty pane. Ivan rose, lit his own oil lamp with a splinter from the stove and hung it from a hook above the table, adjusting the wick until the flame steadied. The lamplight pooled on the table's surface, illuminating the tools, the linen cloth, the cedar box now empty. He would work a little longer, perhaps marking the front panels before eating his evening meal of bread and broth, and then he would sleep, and the frost would thicken outside, and the great cold would hold Moscow in its quiet grip for another night. The next morning inside the workshop on Varvarka Street unfolds with the same profound stillness that has held Moscow for weeks. The tiled stove breathes a steady, muted warmth into the room while its iron door glows with a faint orange pulse. Outside, the great frost of 1708 continues its deep, crystalline grip on the city. Through the frosted window panes, the light that enters is pale and diffused, as though the sun itself were wrapped in wool. Ivan has already begun his day, standing near the heavy work table with a clay cup of steaming herbal brew, its faint scent of meadowsweet mixing with the ever-present aroma of birch smoke. He turns from the stove and walks to the wall, where a small piece of birch bark hangs from an iron nail. On this bark, written in charcoal, are the measurements of the boyar for whom the sable cloak is being made. The figures are simple, the width across the shoulders from seam to seam, the length from the base of the neck to mid-calf, the circumference of the chest, and the length of the arm from the shoulder point to the wrist. Each digit has been formed with a steady hand, the charcoal lines now slightly smudged from being handled. Ivan looks at them for a long moment, letting the dimensions settle into his memory, his lips moving silently as he commits each number to his thoughts. From a wooden shelf beneath the work table, he lifts a folded length of coarse, unbleached linen, the cloth that holds the pattern pieces. As he spreads it across the tabletop, you see the faint charcoal outlines of the cloak's components, a broad back panel with a gently curved top and a straight fall, 2 front panels that mirror one another, tapered sleeves, a high-standing collar piece drawn like a horseshoe, and the generous sweep of the hem. These shapes are not exact templates, but flexible guides that Ivan will adapt to the natural size and drape of the sable pelts. The linen rustles softly, a sound that blends with the low crackle of the fire, and then the room falls quiet again. Now Ivan turns his attention to the sable pelts themselves. The flat cedar box still rests on the table, its lid set aside, and inside lay the 72 prime Barguzin sables, each one dark as shadow with silvery tips. He lists them out one by one and places them first side down on the linen, arranging them in rows according to their dimensions. His hands move with a practiced economy, never fumbling, never hesitating. You watch as he weighs each pelt in his palm, feeling its density and thickness with the same care a baker might assess flour. The finest furs have a springy resilience. When pressed, they slowly regain their shape. Ivan discards no pelt, but he sorts them so that the thickest, most luxuriant pieces will form the back panel where the boyar's shoulders will bear the cloak's weight. The direction of the fur is of great importance. Sable hair grows from the animal's head toward its tail, and once sewn into a garment, the nap must flow downward over the body, so that rain and snow slide off rather than soaking in. Ivan picks up a pelt and holds it near the window, letting the dim light catch the slant of the hair as he strokes it gently with the flat of his hand. The smooth glide that runs from the leather base to the silver tips tells him which way the pelt must lie. He lays it on the back panel space, aligning the nap so that it cascades from the collar toward the hem, then places another pelt beside it and checks that the hair flows in the same direction without any cross-grain that might cause the fur to ruffle when worn. Each pelt is then marked with a tiny stitch of colored thread pulled from a wooden spool of pale blue linen at its top edge, so that during cutting and sewing the orientation will never be mistaken. With the pelts sorted and matched, Ivan reaches for a lump of soft charcoal and a length of hempen string. The charcoal is a refined stick that leaves a smooth, velvety mark, not the gritty kind used for writing. He uses the string as a compass, holding one end at a pivot point and sweeping the other in a gentle arc to trace the curve that will shape the neckline of the back panel. The charcoal whispers across the leather side of the largest pelt, leaving a line that is neither too thick nor too faint. He works slowly, adjusting the arc until it mirrors exactly the pattern on the linen, then moves to the left front panel, laying down the line that will define the shoulder seam and the sloping edge that closes over the chest. His breathing is even, almost inaudible. The only sounds are the scratch of the charcoal, the occasional shift of his leather apron, and the distant crystalline creak of the frost outside. The boyar's arms will need ample room beneath the cloak, so the sleeves must be cut from pelts that are not only dense, but also particularly supple. Ivan gathers 8 medium-sized sables from the second row and examines them individually, bending the leather to test its pliability before selecting those with the least scarring and the most uniform underfur. With the string and charcoal, he sketches the sleeve shapes, a wider curve at the shoulder end that tapers gently to a narrower cuff, mimicking the natural form of the animal's body. He marks the pieces with the same pale blue thread, using a single stitch to denote the left sleeve and 2 stitches for the right, to ensure no confusion later. All the while the stove hums its quiet hum, and the frost thickens on the window glass in fern-like patterns that grow almost imperceptibly. A slight stir reaches your ears as the workshop door opens and a puff of frozen air, visible as a tiny white cloud, curls into the room before the door shuts again. It is Misha, the furrier's apprentice, a boy of 12. He stomps his felt boots on the threshold, shaking off the snow, then carries a bundle of split birch logs to the stove. Without a word, he opens the heavy iron door and feeds the fire with careful precision, first placing a chunk of bark, then 2 logs, and closing the door just as the new wood catches with a soft whoosh. The stove's warmth, which had begun to thin near the corners of the room, rises again and wraps around you like a heavy blanket. Misha then settles onto a low stool in the corner near the basket of raw wool. His task is to card the wool, a process he watched from across the room. He takes 2 rectangular wooden paddles, studded with tiny wire teeth, and loads one with a loose cloud of greasy wool, drawing the other paddle across it in short repetitive strokes that separate the tangled fibers and align them into a soft, airy web. The sound is a gentle shushing, like waves on a distant shore, regular and undemanding. He works steadily, his eyes half-lidded, and the wool slowly transforms from a matted clump into a smooth, fluffy bat that will later be used to pad the shoulders of the cloak or stuff pincushions. Meanwhile, Ivan has finished marking the last of the sable pieces and now stands back to survey the arrangement on the table. The back panel pieces lie in a row, their charcoal curves forming a harmonious sweep when viewed together. The front panels sit beside them, mirror images that will close over the boyar's chest with a slight overlap. The sleeves wait in their own grouping, the left and right pieces neatly distinguished. The collar, that high protective band, is still only a pattern on the linen, and Ivan will cut its pieces later, after the body of the cloak takes shape. For now, the important thing is that every pelt has been placed according to its nature, its thickness, its nap direction, its subtle color shading. When the boyar wears this cloak, the fur will appear as a single living expanse of dark gloss, not a patchwork of individual skins, and achieving that illusion is the essence of a master furrier's craft. He pauses and picks up his clay cup of meadow sweet tea, now cooled to a tepid warmth, and drinks slowly while his gaze rests on the pelts. The tea has a faint honeyed sweetness from a small piece of comb honey he dropped into the brew earlier, and it soothes his throat, which is slightly dry from the stove's heat. He sets the cup down and stretches his fingers, flexing them open and closed several times. The years of work are visible in his hands. The skin is thin over the knuckles, the nails trimmed short and clean, the fingertips calloused but sensitive. These hands will guide the knife and needle through hours of meticulous labor, but before any cutting begins, they must be warmed and limber. So he goes to the stove and holds his palms toward the iron door, letting the radiant heat seep into the joints. Misha glances up from his carding and watches his master without speaking, the workshop having its own language of small gestures and understood routines, and Ivan nods slightly at the boy in silent acknowledgement before returning to the table. Now comes the final check of the nap direction. Ivan lifts the first back panel pelt and holds it suspended by its leather edge, allowing the fur to hang free while he turns it gently and watches how the hair falls and how the light shifts across the silvery tips. Satisfied, he lays it back down and lifts its partner, repeating the same inspection for every piece in a calm, unhurried sequence that fills the room with a repeated rustle of fur against fur. The monotony of the action would be tedious to most, but here it is a kind of meditation, each lift and check blending into the next until you lose track of how many you have seen. The cold outside remains absolute. Through the window the sky is a pale milky grey, and the roofs of the neighbouring houses are stacked with thick caps of snow while nothing moves in the street. The city seems to hold its breath, waiting for the frost to break, though it will not for many weeks yet. The great bell of the nearby church is silent, its clapper frozen solid, and the only sign of life is the thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from chimneys across the Muskva River. Inside the workshop, the stove's gentle radiance creates a small pocket of warmth that feels precious and enclosed, a sanctuary of wool and fur and wood smoke. Misha has finished carding one basket of wool, and now takes up another, the rhythm of his paddles continuing in a background pulse that harmonizes with the crackling fire. Ivan, having completed his inspection, gathers the charcoal-drawn pelts and stacks them carefully on a side table, covering them with a square of clean linen to keep off any dust. He then takes the birch bark with the measurements and places it on a shelf next to the small icon of St. Nicholas that hangs in the corner, a gesture that is half practical and half reverent, for the boyar's dimensions will govern every cut and seam and must be kept safe. As the morning wears on, the light in the workshop shifts from pale pearl to a slightly warmer grey, signaling that the sun, unseen, has climbed somewhere behind the clouds. Ivan takes up a broom made of bound twigs and sweeps the floor around the table, gathering stray bits of charcoal dust and tiny fragments of leather with a slow, almost musical sway. The debris collects into a small pile that he later scoops into a clay pot, because cleanliness is important in a furrier's trade. Stray dirt could work its way into the fur and dull its luster or blunt the fine edge of the cutting knife. The sweeping finished, he returns to the stool by the table and sits for a moment resting. You find a seat on a wooden bench near the wall, and from there you can see the whole workspace. The hanging furs silhouetted against the rafters, the linen patterns still spread on the table, the cedar box with the remaining pelts that will become the collar and trim, the boyar's measurements on the birch bark by the icon, the apprentice Misha with his wool and paddles, and Ivan himself with hands folded in his lap and eyes half closed at alert. The quiet is total, a deep cushion of silence that fills your ears with a soft, steady hum of your own presence. The frost outside may crack and heave, the world may be bound in ice, but here in the warmth of the workshop, time moves at the pace of a single breath, measured not by clocks, but by the careful preparation of fur and thread. And so the second day of the making of the Sable Cloak passes, a day given over entirely to measuring, sorting, marking, and aligning. No needle pierces leather, no knife parts fur. All that occurs is the laying of a foundation, as firm and deliberate as the foundation stones of the boyar's house. When the light begins to fade and the stove's glow becomes the brightest source of light, Ivan rises and lights a small oil lamp, its flame a steady amber teardrop. He trims the wick with a pair of iron scissors, and the light settles, casting long, soft shadows across the table. The workshop, with its scents of beeswax and sable and birch smoke, feels suspended in a gentle amber glow, ready for whatever the next day will bring. But that is still hours away, and for now there is only the warmth, the stillness, and the slow, methodical preparation that will one day become a cloak fit for a boyar in the heart of the great frost. The third morning in the workshop on Varvara Street arrives with a light that is softer than the days before, as if the cold itself has filtered the sun through layers of ice and cloud, until only a gentle grey glow remains. You stand just inside the door, and the first thing you notice is a new sound, a delicate whispering scrape that repeats in a steady rhythm. Ivan is at the grindstone, a flat piece of river rock that sits on a wooden block near the window, and he's sharpening his round cutting knife. The blade curves in a half-moon shape, its edge dulled from previous work, and as Ivan moves it in small circles against the wetted stone, the metal begins to gleam with a cold silver light. A few drops of water from a clay bowl keep the surface slick, and the sound is a hush-hush that blends with the stove's murmur and the distant sigh of wind outside. He sharpens the knife for a long time, turning it over to work both sides equally, pausing occasionally to test the edge with the pad of his thumb. When he is satisfied, he wipes the blade clean with a scrap of linen and holds it up to the window, where the pale light runs along its curve like water. The knife is old, its wooden handle darkened by decades of palm sweat, but the steel is still true, and Ivan sets it on the table with the same reverence he might offer a trusted companion. Beside it he places the bone folder, the measure cord, and a small pot of powdered chalk, which he will use to brighten the charcoal lines if they become faint during handling. The moment of the first cut has come, and the workshop seems to hold its breath. Ivan walks to the side table where the pelts wait under their linen cover, lifts the cloth, and selects the largest of the back panel pieces. He carries it with both hands, cradling it like something fragile, and lays it on the work table with the leather side facing up. The charcoal line he drew yesterday still marks the pelt clearly, a sweeping curve that defines the shoulder and the neckline, and he traces it once with a dry fingertip, committing its path to memory before he begins. The leather is pale cream, thin and supple, and you can see the faint network of veins that once carried life through the animal's coat. Ivan positions the pelt so that the marked line runs along the edge of the table, giving his knife hand a clear path. He braces the leather with his left hand, fingers spread wide and pressing gently to keep the surface flat, while his right hand takes up the round knife. The blade hovers for a moment above the starting point, a notch at the top of the curve, and then it descends. The first cut is a soft, sighing sound, the steel parting the leather with an ease that speaks of the morning's sharpening. You watch the blade, follow the charcoal, moving at an unhurried pace. Ivan never pushes, never forces, but lets the knife travel along the line as if drawn by the curve itself. The cut edges fall apart with a whisper, revealing the dense darkness of the fur on the underside, and the scent of sable rises faintly, sweet and clean. He cuts the entire back panel piece in one continuous motion, only stopping when the blade reaches the bottom hemline. Then he lifts the cut shape away from the surrounding leather, holding it up to the light, turning it slightly to check that the nap runs from top to bottom in a smooth, uninterrupted flow. The uncut scraps fall into a pile on the side, destined for other uses, collar trim, small patches, or practice material for Misha. Ivan sets the finished piece on a clean section of the table and picks up the next pelt, the one that will form the other half of the back. The charcoal line on this piece mirrors the first, and he checks the red stitch marker to confirm the top edge before positioning the leather for the knife. Again the blade descends, and again the soft sigh of parting leather fills the room. The process is rhythmic, a cycle of position, press, cut, and lift, each repetition blending into the next like breaths in sleep. The morning wears on in this way, marked not by hours, but by the number of cut pieces accumulating on the table. After the back panels come the front pieces, each one requiring its own careful handling because the curves are different. A gentle inward slope at the neck, a straight fall at the front opening, and a slight flare at the hem to allow movement. Ivan adjusts his hand position for each cut, sometimes tilting the blade to navigate tighter arcs, sometimes using the bone folder to hold down the leather where his fingers cannot reach. The stove's warmth ebbs slightly as the fire consumes its logs, and a chill begins to creep into the far corners of the workshop once more. Misha, who's been watching from his stool while carding a fresh basket of wool, notices the change in temperature, without being told to notice it. He sets aside his tools, crosses to the woodpile, and selects 2 thick birch logs that he feeds through the stove door with a practiced economy of movement. The fire latches onto the new fuel and grows bright, sending a fresh wave of warmth through the tiled walls, and Misha returns to his stool where the wool waits. The paddles resume their gentle shushing sound, a backdrop to the quiet work of the knife. Ivan pauses only once during the cutting of the front panels, not because his hand is tired, but because a small knot in the leather requires attention. The knot is a natural scar, a place where the sable's skin had healed from a long ago scratch, and the tissue is thicker and less flexible than the surrounding area. He examines it through narrowed eyes, then uses the smallest of his knives, a pinpoint blade reserved for delicate work, to carefully trim around the imperfection so that it will not create a stiff spot in the finished seam. The trimmed piece joins the scrap pile, and the corrected edge now follows a clean, smooth line. He resumes cutting without comment, his face calm and expressionless. The sleeves come next. These pieces are smaller and more numerous, 8 in total, each one a tapered shape that will wrap around the boyar's arm from shoulder to wrist. The pelts chosen for the sleeves are especially soft, and the knife glides through them with even less resistance than before. Ivan cuts the first sleeve piece, then the second, stacking them in a neat pile on the corner of the table, where the pale blue thread stitches that mark left and right are clearly visible. He cuts all 8 pieces without hurry, and when he finishes, he flexes his fingers and rubs his palms together to keep the blood moving. The cold outside has not lessened, and even with the stove fed, the air in the workshop holds a crisp edge that makes the joints ache after long stillness. You notice that Misha has stopped carding and is now watching the cutting with a quiet intensity. The boy's apprenticeship is built on observation as much as practice, and the way Ivan handles the knife is a lesson in itself. The angle of the blade, the pressure of the hand, the way the cut always follows the charcoal without deviation. Ivan glances at the boy, and without a word he picks up a small scrap of sable leather and a piece of charcoal, and begins to draw a simple curved line on it. He pushes the scrap across the table toward Misha, along with an older, blunter knife that he keeps for teaching. Misha rises from his stool and approaches the table, understanding the invitation. He takes the scrap and the knife, and under Ivan's watchful eye, he practices a cut, pressing too hard at first so that the blade judders, then adjusting to a lighter touch. The blade moves shakily along the line, not as smoothly as Ivan's, but it follows the curve without straying. Ivan nods once and returns to his own work, and Misha, having completed a single successful cut, goes back to his wool, carrying the small triumph silently. Now the table holds all the major pieces of the cloak, cut and ready. They lie in organized groups, the back panel pieces, the 2 front panels, the 8 sleeve parts, and the still uncut collar pelts that wait for a later stage. Ivan picks up each piece and inspects its cut edge, checking for any fraying or unevenness. The leather, being properly dressed, holds a clean edge without tearing, and what slight roughness he finds, he smooths with the bone folder, burnishing the rim with a few firm strokes until it is flat and soft. The bone folder has a pleasing weight in his hand, and it leaves a slight polish on the leather, a faint sheen that will help the seam lie flat when stitched. The scrap pile has grown substantial. Ivan sifts through it with his fingers, separating the larger offcuts from the tiny trimmings. The larger pieces will be sewn together to form the lining for the pockets. Though the boyar's cloak may not have pockets, Ivan sets them aside anyway, because nothing is wasted in a furrier's workshop. The small scraps, the narrow ribbons and irregular triangles will be used by Misha to practice his stitching or to stuff pincushions. The air is filled with the soft rustle of leather as Ivan tidies up, his movements slow and methodical, and the stove gives a low, satisfied pop. Morning has passed into early afternoon. The light from the window, never strong, has begun to shift its angle, and the frost patterns on the glass, which had been intricate fern-like shapes, now glow slightly as the unseen sun reaches its zenith beyond the clouds. Ivan steps away from the table and walks to the window, rubbing a small circle in the frost with his sleeve to peer outside. The street is empty, the snow unmarked except for a single line of sled tracks that curves toward the river. The buildings opposite are shrouded in white, their roofs thick with snow, and a thin wisp of smoke rises straight into the still air from a chimney. He lets the circle freeze over again and returns to the warmth of the stove, where he stands for a moment with his back to the fire, feeling the heat seep through his wool shirt. Misha has prepared a fresh pot of meadow sweet tea, the dried flowers steeping in hot water until the brew turns a pale golden green. He pours it into Ivan's clay cup and sets it on the table, and then pours a smaller cup for himself, the steam rising in delicate curls. The two of them drink without speaking, their faces lit by the glow of the stove and the soft amber of the oil lamp that Ivan has lit as the day dims. The tea is warm and slightly sweet, and it chases away the chill that had settled in their bones during the long hours of patient work. Outside, the great frost continues its silent reign, but inside, in the small world of the workshop, there is a profound and steady peace. When the tea is finished, Ivan returns to the table and takes up the cut pieces once more. This time he is not cutting but numbering. He threads a needle with a length of differently colored thread, a pale green this time, and sews a tiny stitch into the seam allowance of each piece according to the order in which they must be joined. The green stitches mark the sequence: back panel first, then the front panels, then the sleeves. The system is simple and invisible from the fur side, but it will save hours of confusion later when the cloak begins to take shape. He works the needle with the same care he uses for the knife, each stitch a neat half loop that catches the leather without piercing through to the fur. The needle glints in the lamplight, and the thread pulls through with a faint, satisfying whisper. Misha, having finished his tea, returns to his stool and picks up a small piece of scrap leather, not the one he practiced cutting on, but a fresh one, and begins to practice his stitching under the low light. He uses a blunt needle and a thick thread, making simple running stitches along the edge of the scrap, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. His stitches are uneven but improving, and the rhythm of his needle is slow and steady, a quieter echo of Ivan's own work. The workshop settles into its afternoon rhythm, the sound of two needles punctuating the silence like soft, irregular heartbeats. The cutting is done. The pelts that were once whole and complete now lie in pieces, each one shaped to its purpose, waiting for the thread that will bind them into a single garment. Ivan gathers the cut work, places it on the cedar box lid for safekeeping, and covers it with the linen cloth. He then takes up the bone folder and the chalk pot, cleans the blade of his round knife with a drop of oil and a soft rag, and stores each tool in its proper place on the felt strip. The workshop is orderly, the scraps swept into a basket, the wool carded, the fire burning low but steady. The day's work has been one of quiet transformation, the first cut marking the boundary between raw material and something that is beginning to be made. You look around the room and see the shadows lengthening, the frost on the window deepening, and the lamplight holding its small circle of warmth against the encroaching cold. Ivan sits on his stool, hands resting on his apron, and closes his eyes for just a moment, not sleeping but resting, the way a craftsman rests between tasks. Misha continues his practice stitches, the needle dipping and rising, and outside, the city of Moscow remains silent under the weight of the great frost, as if time itself has frozen solid. The first cut has been made, and the work will continue tomorrow. But for now, there is only the stillness, the warmth, and the patient quiet of a winter workshop. The fourth day in the workshop begins without ceremony, the same pale grey light filtering through the frost-covered window, the same steady warmth pulsing from the tiled stove. Ivan rises from his stool, where he has been sitting for some time already, having eaten a simple breakfast of black bread and warm broth before you even entered the room. He walks to the work table and surveys the cut pieces of sable that lie waiting under their linen cover, then turns his attention to the tools that will carry the next stage of the work. The knife has done its part. Now the needle must take over. And before the needle can move through leather, the thread must be prepared with a care equal to every step that has come before. He reaches for a large block of beeswax that sits on a corner of the table, a rectangular cake the color of pale honey, its surface grooved with countless passes of thread from years of use. Beside it, he places a spool of strong linen thread, not the thin kind used for fine embroidery, but a thicker, sturdier variety that has been spun tightly and will hold fast against the tension of many seams. The thread is a soft cream color, almost white, and it gleams faintly in the lamplight. Ivan pulls a length of it from the spool, measuring it against the span of his outstretched arms, then snips it cleanly with a pair of iron scissors. He repeats this process until a dozen lengths lie in a neat bundle on the table, each one exactly the same measure as its siblings. Now the waxing begins. Ivan takes the first length of thread and draws it across the surface of the beeswax block, pressing it gently into the groove with his thumb so that the wax coats the fibers evenly. He pulls the thread through the wax in one smooth motion, from end to end, never rubbing back and forth because that would cause the fibers to fray and weaken. The sound is a soft, steady zip, a whisper of friction that repeats with each pass, and the air in the workshop takes on a faint, clean scent of honey and wax that mingles with the ever-present birch smoke. After the first pass, he holds the thread up to the light and examines it, checking that the wax has penetrated all the way to the core. The thread now has a slight tackiness, a grip that will help it hold fast in the leather, without slipping. He draws each length through the wax 3 times, building up a thin, even coat that will protect the linen from moisture and make it glide more smoothly through the needle holes. With 12 lengths to prepare, the task occupies him for the better part of an hour, though time in the workshop has a way of stretching and softening, so that an hour feels indistinguishable from a moment. You watch his hands move in their steady rhythm, pick up a thread, lay it across the wax, press with the thumb, pull, inspect, set aside. The repetition is deeply calming, a cycle without urgency or variation, and the bundle of waxed threads grows slowly on the clean linen cloth beside the wax block. Misha arrives partway through the waxing, slipping through the door with a gust of cold air that vanishes almost instantly in the warmth of the stove. He carries a small covered pot that holds a portion of hot kasha, which he sets on the corner of the stove to keep warm. Seeing his master occupied with the thread, he takes his place on the low stool without a word and reaches for the second basket of wool that still needs carding. His wooden paddles begin their familiar shushing rhythm, and the workshop fills with its usual layered quiet. The crackle of the fire, the zip of thread through wax, the soft scrape of wool fibers being drawn apart. When all 12 lengths are waxed, Ivan coils each one into a loose loop and hangs them from a wooden peg on the wall near the table, where they dangle like pale vines. He then selects 3 of his curved needles from the felt tool roll, examining each one under the lamplight for any sign of rust or dullness. The needles are crescent-shaped, designed specifically for the furrier's whip stitch, allowing the point to enter the leather at a shallow angle without piercing through to the fur side. Their eyes are small and oval, and Ivan holds one up close to his face, squinting slightly, then passes the tip of a finer needle through the eye to clear any debris that might snag the thread. Threading the needles is a task that requires stillness and precision. He pinches the end of one waxed thread between thumb and forefinger, rolling it into a sharp point, then guides it toward the needle's eye with the patience of a man who has done this 10,000 times. The thread slides through on the first attempt, and he pulls the short tail free, leaving the longer portion to do the sewing. He knots the tail with a simple overhand loop, tightening it close to the eye so the thread will not pull free during stitching, then sticks the threaded needle into a pincushion stuffed with sheep's wool. He repeats the process for the second needle and the third, until all 3 stand ready in the pincushion like tiny spears in a miniature field. With the needles threaded and the waxed thread hanging nearby, Ivan turns at last to the cut sable pieces themselves. He lifts the linen cover and removes the 2 back panel pelts, carrying them to the center of the table and laying them side by side with the leather surfaces facing up. The edges that will be joined run along a gently curved line from the neck to the hem, and he checks the green stitches he sewed earlier to confirm that these two pieces are indeed meant to be paired. The charcoal lines are still visible, though slightly faded from handling, and he traces them with a dry fingertip to renew the path in his mind before any stitching commences. Now he must position the pelts correctly. The Furrier's whip stitch requires the two leather edges to overlap slightly, fur side down, so that the seam will be invisible from the outside when the cloak is finished. Ivan takes the first back panel pelt and flips it fur side down, then does the same with the second, aligning their edges so that they overlap by the width of a finger. He smooths the leather flat with his palm, pressing out any wrinkles or air pockets, then places a series of small iron weights along the seam line to hold the pieces in place. The weights are flat discs no larger than coins, and they sit on the leather with a soft, definite pressure. He picks up the first threaded needle from the pincushion and settles onto his stool, adjusting his position until the light from the oil lamp falls directly on the seam. The first stitch is always taken with a certain deliberate calm, a moment of transition from preparation to creation. He pinches the overlapping leather edges between his left thumb and forefinger, holding them in alignment, and inserts the needle point into the leather at an angle so shallow it barely dimples the surface before breaking through. The needle emerges on the far side of the overlap, and he pulls it through slowly, drawing the waxed thread after it with a faint, satisfying hiss. The thread seats itself in the waxed groove of the leather, and he tightens it just enough to bring the edges together without puckering. The second stitch follows the first, entering the leather a finger's width further along the seam. Ivan works with a rhythm that is almost musical in its steadiness. Pierce, pull, tighten, advance. Pierce, pull, tighten, advance. His hands move in a smooth complementary dance, the left holding and guiding while the right wields the needle, and the thread follows behind like a pale snake winding through the leather. The stitches are small and even, each one the same length as its neighbors, forming a line of tiny dashes along the seam allowance. From the fur side, nothing is visible at all. The dense sable hair hides the stitching completely. You watch this process for a long stretch of time, lulled by the repetition. The needle catches the lamplight with each pass, flashing briefly before dipping into the leather, and the thread pulls through with a sound so soft it is barely audible over the stove's murmur. Ivan does not speak, does not look up, does not vary his pace. He sews as steadily as a man breathing in sleep, and the seam grows slowly beneath his fingers. The cold outside might as well be on another continent. Inside the workshop, there is only the stitch, the thread, and the quiet presence of the fur. Misha finishes carding his basket of wool and rises to feed the stove, adding 2 logs and adjusting the flue before returning to his stool. He has been watching Ivan's stitching from the corner of his eye, absorbing the technique without conscious effort, the way a child learns language by listening. He picks up his own practice scrap and a blunt needle and begins to mimic the whip stitch along the edge of the leather. His stitch is wobblier than Ivan's but recognizable as the same pattern. The 2 needles move in counterpoint, one experienced and fluid, the other tentative and learning, and the workshop holds them both in its patient embrace. Ivan sews until the first back seam is complete, a line of stitches running from the neck curved down to the hem. He ties off the thread with a small, tight knot, snips the excess with his scissors, and then lifts the joined pelts to inspect his work, turning the piece fur side up. He fluffs the hair along the seam line with his fingertips, watching how the sable springs back into place and hides the join absolutely. The seam is invisible, 2 distinct pelts, now reading as a single continuous surface of dark, glossy fur. He nods once and lays the piece down again, smoothing it flat on the table. The second back seam awaits, connecting the third pelt to the pair already joined. Ivan repositions the iron weights, aligns the overlapping edges, and begins again with the same methodical rhythm. The morning has passed without notice. The light through the frosty window has shifted and softened, and Misha has set aside his practice scrap to prepare a midday meal. He ladles the hot kasha into 2 wooden bowls, places a slice of black bread beside each, and sets one bowl next to Ivan's elbow. Ivan finishes the stitch he is on, lays the needle on the table, and pauses to eat. The kasha is warm and filling, made from buckwheat groats with a small knob of butter melting in the center, and the bread is dense and slightly sour. They eat without conversation, the spoons plinking softly against the wood, and when the meal is done, Misha takes the bowls to a bucket of water to rinse them. After eating, Ivan does not immediately return to the needle. Instead, he takes a short walk around the workshop, stretching his back and rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness that comes from bending over the table. He checks the frost on the window, noting that it has grown thicker overnight and now forms a solid white sheet through which no detail of the street can be seen. He checks the furs hanging from the rafters, brushing dust from a bundle of fox pelts that will not be needed for many months. He checks the oil lamp, topping it up from a small clay jug. These small tasks are all part of his rhythm, a way of resetting his eyes and hands before the next long session of stitching. When he returns to the table, he picks up the second threaded needle from the pincushion, the first having grown slightly dull from the morning's work. The fresh needle glides into the leather with an ease that is immediately noticeable, and the afternoon sewing begins with a renewed smoothness. Ivan joins the second back seam, then moves on to the side seams where the front panels will attach to the back. The front panels are shaped differently, with a gentle inward curve at the neck that requires him to adjust his stitch angle slightly, and he does this without breaking rhythm, tilting the needle to follow the new line as naturally as water follows a slope. You notice that every seam receives a second pass of the bone folder after the stitching is complete. Ivan takes the smooth paddle-shaped tool and runs it firmly along the stitched line, pressing the seam flat and burnishing the leather to a subtle sheen. The pressure helps to seat the wax thread deeper into the fibers and ensures that no puckers or ridges will show through on the fur side. The bone folder makes a soft creaking sound as it travels over the leather, a sound that joins the other noises of the workshop like a familiar voice. The afternoon stretches on. Misha, having finished all his carding for the day, is now occupied with trimming the large sable scraps into small uniform rectangles that will be used to stuff a new pincushion. He uses a small knife of his own, one that Ivan gave him at the start of his apprenticeship, and he cuts with a focused intensity, his tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth. The scraps accumulate in a basket at his feet, and the pile of trimmed rectangles grows on his stool beside him. It is simple work, but it teaches him the feel of the leather and the way the knife responds to different thicknesses, lessons that will serve him when he is older and cutting pelts of his own. Evening approaches with a gradual dimming of the already pale light, and Ivan lights a second oil lamp to supplement the first, hanging it from a hook on the opposite side of the table so that no shadow falls across his work. The double lamps cast a warm golden glow that makes the sable fur look even richer, the silver tips catching the light like tiny frost crystals. He has completed the back seams and the right side seam by now, and the left side seam is half finished. The cloak is beginning to take on a recognizable shape, a garment emerging from its component parts, though there is still much to do before it can be worn. Ivan ties off the left side seam temporarily, leaving the thread attached because he will resume it in the morning, and sets the needle back in the pincushion. He covers the partially assembled cloak with the linen cloth and places the iron weights on top of the cloth to keep it from shifting overnight. The workshop is tidied, scraps swept into their basket, tools wiped and stored, the stove banked with a large log that will burn slowly through the night. Misha puts on his heavy coat and felt boots, nods a quiet goodnight to Ivan, and slips out the door into the frozen darkness, heading for the small room where he sleeps in a neighboring building. Ivan remains alone in the workshop for a while longer, sitting on his stool and looking at the covered cloak on the table. The silence is now complete, broken only by the occasional creak of the cooling stove. He rubs a little of the beeswax salve into his fingertips, which are sore from the day's stitching, and then blows out one of the oil lamps, leaving only the faint glow of the stove's embers to light the room. The frost outside continues its slow, silent work, and the city of Moscow sleeps under its blanket of ice. In the workshop, the needle waits in the pincushion, the thread hangs from its peg, and the sable cloak rests under its linen cover, halfway between raw fur and finished garment, patient and still in the heart of the great frost. The fifth morning arrives in a hush of falling snow so fine that it seems to hang suspended in the air before settling on the frozen streets of Moscow. Inside the workshop on Varvarka Street, the world is smaller, warmer, and quieter still. Ivan has already fed the stove with a fresh birch log, and the tiled surface radiates a gentle heat that reaches every corner of the room, while the oil lamp burns with its steady amber flame. He stands beside the work table, lifting the linen cover from the partially assembled cloak and setting the small iron weights aside in a neat row. Before him lies the back panel, still incomplete, its seams half-stitched and waiting. You watch as he settles onto his stool, adjusts the position of the lamp so that its light falls directly on the leather, and picks up the threaded needle that he left in the pin cushion the night before. The left side seam remains open from the midpoint down to the hem, the waxed thread still attached and ready. Ivan pinches the overlapping edges between his thumb and forefinger, aligning them with the same care he gave the first stitches, and resumes his work exactly where he paused. The needle enters the leather with a soft, familiar sigh, and the rhythm of pierce, pull, tighten re-establishes itself without hesitation, as if the night had been only a brief blink. He sews in quarter-span sections, a hand's length at a time, stopping after each segment to set down the needle and reach for the bone folder. The paddle-shaped tool, worn smooth by decades of use, presses firmly along the fresh stitches, burnishing the seam flat and seating the waxed thread deeper into the leather's fibers. As the bone travels over the leather, it leaves a faint polished sheen, and Ivan runs a fingertip over the line afterward to feel for any ridge or pucker. Finding none, he then flips the cloak fur side up and fluffs the hair along the join with a gentle brushing motion of his hand, watching the dark sable spring back into place so that the seam vanishes entirely into a single unbroken expanse of glossy fur. Sometimes the nap does not lie as perfectly as he wants. When the hair catches the light at a slightly different angle on one side of the seam, revealing the join as a faint line, he turns the cloak over again and examines the stitching. More often than not, the issue is a single stitch, pulled a fraction too tight, which causes the leather to dimple and the fur above it to splay outward. Ivan takes up his smallest knife, the one with the pinpoint blade, and carefully slips the tip under the offending stitch, lifting it just enough to cut the thread without nicking the leather. He pulls the severed stitch free, smooths the leather flat with his thumb, and rethreads the needle through the same hole, but with a lighter tension, blending the seam back into invisibility. Then he resumes the steady forward progress, his patience as deep and calm as the winter itself. While Ivan works on the back panel, Misha is occupied at the corner bench with a different task. Having finished all the wool carding the day before, he now sits before a wide wooden comb, its teeth carved from beechwood and spaced evenly like a miniature fence. Beside him rests a basket of sable fur scraps, the soft offcuts from the cutting stage, each piece still bearing the glossy dark hair and silvery tips. His job is to comb these scraps, drawing them gently through the teeth to align the hairs in one direction so that the fur will be smooth and uniform when Ivan uses it later for the cloak's collar trim. The comb makes a soft, rustling whisper as Misha pulls a scrap through, turns it and draws it again, and his hands move in the same slow, deliberate pattern as Ivan's stitching, a mirror of patience across the room. Snow continues to fall outside, thickening from a fine mist into a steady drift of large, soft flakes that build silently on the window ledge and blur the frost patterns into a solid white curtain. The street is invisible now, the city beyond the workshop erased by the storm, and the only indication of the outside world is the faint creak of the roof beams as the weight of new snow settles upon them. Inside, the stove hums and pops, the oil lamp hisses softly, and the two workers breathe in quiet unison with their tasks, creating a small pocket of timelessness within the great cold. The sewing of the back panel progresses slowly through the morning. After completing the left side seam, Ivan moves on to the center seam that will join the two halves of the back together. This is the longest seam, running from the gentle curve at the neck all the way down to the straight hem, and it requires the most careful matching of nap because any misalignment here will be visible across the entire width of the boyar's shoulders. He positions the two large sections on the table, leather side up, and aligns their edges with the green guide stitches meeting perfectly. A series of iron weights holds everything in place, and then the needle begins its journey from top to bottom, stitch by stitch. He pauses more frequently on this seam, checking the fur side after every quarter span, fluffing the hair and sighting along the surface like a carpenter checking a level. A few stitches require the knife and the re-sewing, and Ivan attends to these without frustration, accepting each small correction as a natural part of the work. The goal is not speed, but a seam so well joined that even the boyar's steward, who had a sharp eye, would run his hand over the fur and feel only a single continuous flow. The bone folder follows each completed segment, and the leather grows warm under its pressure, the wax melting ever so slightly into the fibers to create a bond that will hold for decades. Time passes in the steady cycle of needle and thread, and you might find your attention drifting into the rhythm itself. The soft pierce of the needle, the whisper of the thread pulling through, the tap of the bone folder on the table as Ivan sets it down. The cycle repeats, and the scene grows, and the snow piles higher against the door. Misha empties his first basket of combed scraps and refills it, his head bent low over the wooden comb, and the rustle of fur through beechwood teeth weaves a gentle counterpoint to the stitching sounds. No one speaks. The workshop has no need of words. By the time the pale light outside begins its slow shift toward afternoon, the center seam is finished. Ivan ties off the thread with a tight knot, snips the excess, and then lifts the entire back panel to let it hang from his raised hands. The cloak back drapes before him a curtain of glossy darkness that sways slightly with his breath, and the seams are nowhere to be seen. The 6 matched pelts have become one unified piece, the fur flowing from top to bottom in a smooth, uninterrupted cascade, and the silver tips shimmer faintly even in the low lamplight. He lets it hang for a moment longer, then lays it carefully on the table, and runs the bone folder one final time along all the seams, pressing them flat with a slow, firm stroke that seals the work. Now the back panel is structurally complete, but Ivan does not yet set it aside. He reaches for a wide wooden peg that protrudes from the wall near the stove. A peg he has used for many cloaks over the years, and from it he hangs the back panel by its neck edge so that the fur can rest and settle into its natural fall. Hanging the piece allows the weight of the sable to stretch the seams gently, revealing any tight spots that might need loosening, and it also keeps the fur from becoming crushed or flattened during the remaining work. The dark pelt hangs there like a sleeping animal, the stove's warmth rippling across its surface in gentle waves, and the lamplight catches the silver tips in a soft glow. With the back panel hung, Ivan steps away from the table and stretches his arms above his head, rolling his shoulders and flexing his fingers. He walks to the window, but the glass is now completely opaque with frost and snow, so he simply stands before it for a moment, listening to the muffled hush of the storm beyond the walls. The world outside is reduced to a soft white silence, and the workshop feels even more like a sanctuary, a warm cocoon of wood and wool and fur. He turns back to the room and sees Misha holding up a particularly fine scrap of sable that is combed out into a perfect glossy fan, the hairs all flowing in one direction like water. Ivan nods once, a quiet acknowledgement, and Misha places the scrap in the special basket reserved for collar trim. The afternoon's work is simpler. Ivan takes the front panels from the pile of cut pieces and lays them on the table, checking their edges and the green guide stitches that will later attach them to the back. He does not begin sewing them yet. Instead, he prepares the pieces by running the bone folder along their cut edges to burnish the leather and prevent any fraying, and he inspects each one for the tiny knot scars or thin spots that he might have missed during cutting. Finding a small thin patch near the hem of the left front panel, he sets it aside and selects a scrap of matching sable from the basket, trimming it to a precise patch that he will sew into place as reinforcement when the lining is attached. This small repair takes him some time, and he works it with the same patient attention he gives every other task, the needle dipping in and out around the patch's edges until the thin spot is strengthened and the leather surface is smooth once again. Misha finishes the last of the fur scraps and brings the basket of combed collar trim to the table for Ivan's inspection. The boy has done well. The fibers are all aligned, soft and uniform, and the silver tips catch the light like a dusting of frost. Ivan sifts through the basket with his fingers, lifts a pinch of the fur, and lets it fall back in a silky drift, then sets the basket on a high shelf where the trim will stay clean and dry until the collar is ready to be assembled. Misha then sweeps the floor with a twig broom, gathering stray bits of leather and thread, while the stove gives a low crackle and the snow continues its silent accumulation outside. As evening draws near, the lamplight becomes the only light in the room, for the window has turned a deep, solid blue-gray with the onset of dusk. Ivan lights the second oil lamp and hangs it from the beam above the table. the twin flames pushing the shadows back into the corners. He stands before the hanging back panel and examines it one more time, running his hand lightly over the fur from the neck to the hem, feeling the seams with his fingertips. There are no ridges, no rough spots, no catches. The back panel is complete. It hangs there, a weight of darkness and warmth, and the work of 5 days is visible in its quiet perfection. He takes a moment then to tidy the workshop for the night, returning the bone folder to its place on the felt roll, wiping the needles with a drop of oil, and covering the front panels on the table with the linen cloth. He banks the stove with a large log that will smolder slowly until morning, and Misha pulls on his heavy coat and felt boots, the same quiet ritual as every evening. Before the boy leaves, Ivan hands him a small piece of the waxed thread and a blunt needle, a gift for him to practice his stitching in his own room if he wishes, and Misha accepts it with a nod before disappearing into the swirling snow beyond the door. Alone in the workshop, Ivan lingers for a while, as he often does. He sits on his stool and looks at the back panel hanging on the wall, the glossy fur gleaming under the lamplight, the seams invisible, the nap falling straight and true. The stove ticks softly as it cools, and the frost creaks in the rafters, and the snow outside muffles the world into a deep, peaceful silence. The cloak is not finished, but its spine is strong, and the rest will follow in its own time. He blows out one lamp, then the other, leaving only the soft orange glow of the stove's embers to fill the room, and he sits there in the near darkness for a little while longer, letting the quiet of the great frost wrap around him like the very fur he has sewn. The 6th morning arrived with a cold so deep and penetrating that even the workshop, with its thick log walls and faithful stove, could not entirely keep it at bay. Ivan rose from his narrow bed in the back room, pulled on his woolen shirt and sheepskin vest, and stepped into the main workspace to find that the water in the stone washbasin had frozen over during the night. A thin film of ice, milky and opaque, sealed the surface, and when he touched it with a knuckle, the ice crackled into delicate shards that floated on the dark water beneath. He broke the rest with his fingers, scooped a handful of the icy water, and washed his face and hands quickly, the shock of cold tightening his skin and clearing the last traces of sleep from his eyes. Then he crossed to the stove, opened the iron door, and stood so close that the heat pressed against his damp cheeks while the flames flickered orange and gold behind the grate. He remained there for some time, flexing his fingers open and closed, turning his hands over and back until the stiffness loosened and the blood returned to the fingertips. The warmth seeped through his shirt and into his shoulders, and he let out a slow breath that misted faintly despite the fire. Misha had not yet arrived, and the workshop was entirely silent except for the low roar of the stove and the occasional snap of a log settling. So Ivan had a few moments of solitude to gather himself before the day's work began. He rubbed his hands together one last time, then took up the beeswax salve from its shelf and worked a small amount into his knuckles, the same morning ritual he had performed for years. When he felt ready, he walked to the work table and lifted the linen cover from the 2 front panels that he had prepared the evening before. They lay side by side, mirror images of each other, their leather surfaces pale and smooth, with the charcoal line still faintly visible along the curved edges. The front panels were shaped to close over the boyar's chest, each one rising to a gentle neckline and falling straight to the hem, and the armsy curves, the scooped openings where the sleeves would later attach, had been cut with a careful, sweeping arc. Ivan ran his fingertips along these curves, checking for any roughness that might need burnishing, but the bone folder had done its work, and the leather felt soft and even. He positioned the panels on the table so that their shoulder edges faced upward, ready to be joined to the back panel that still hung from the wooden peg on the wall. Crossing the room, he lifted the back panel down with both hands, cradling its weight, and brought it to the table where he spread it fur side down, aligning the neckline with the front pieces. The green guide stitches that he had sewed days earlier now served their purpose, marking exactly where the front panels should meet the back, and he matched them point to point, adjusting the position of the leather until the alignment was perfect. Small iron weights held everything in place while he threaded a fresh needle with a new length of waxed linen thread. The needle curved and sharp, the thread drawn through the beeswax block 3 times in the same careful preparation as before. The first seam of the day was the right shoulder, a short but critical line that would connect the front panel to the back and define how the cloak hung from the boyar's frame. Ivan began at the neck edge, pinching the leather between his left thumb and forefinger, and inserted a needle at its characteristic shallow angle. The thread pulled through with a soft whisper, and he tightened it just enough to bring the two pieces together without puckering. The second stitch followed, and the third, each one placed a finger's width from its neighbor, the rhythm establishing itself as naturally as breathing. The needle flashed in the lamplight, the thread hissed through the leather, and the seam grew stitch by stitch along the curve of the shoulder. Halfway through the shoulder seam he paused and lifted the partially assembled cloak from the table, holding it up by the neckline to let the fabric drape. The weight of the sable was surprising. The fur was dense, and the leather, though supple, had a substantial heft that added up across the many pelts. When worn, the cloak would settle on the boyar's shoulders with a gravity that felt almost ceremonial, a stately presence that would remind the wearer of its presence with every movement. Ivan observed how the front panel hung against the back, checking that the nap flowed smoothly downward and that no twisting had occurred. Satisfied, he laid the cloak down again, repositioned the weights, and finished the remaining stitches of the shoulder seam, tying off the thread with a tight, neat knot. The left shoulder seam came next, and he repeated the process exactly, aligning the guide stitches, sewing from the neck outward, and pausing midway to lift the cloak and test the drape. With both shoulders joined, the cloak began to resemble its final form. The back and front now formed a single connected piece that could be held up and turned. Ivan took a moment to do just that, lifting the cloak with both hands and turning it fur side out, so that he could inspect the shoulder joins from the outside. He fluffed the fur along the seam lines with his fingertips, encouraging the hairs to mingle and hide the stitches, and after a few moments of gentle brushing, the seams vanished completely into the glossy dark surface. Outside, the world made itself known in small, distant sounds that barely penetrated the workshop walls. Somewhere on the frozen street, a cart creaked as its wheels ground against the packed snow, the sound low and groaning, and a dog barked once before falling silent. The noises were so muffled by the cold and the snow that they might have been imagined, and Ivan, intent on his work, did not look up from the table. The frost on the window had grown so thick that it was now a solid white slab, and no detail of the street could be seen even if he had turned to look. The cart creaked once more, further away, and then the silence returned, deeper than before. With the shoulder seams complete, Ivan turned his attention to the armholes. These openings, cut in a smooth oval curve at the sides of the cloak, would bear considerable stress once the sleeves were attached and the garment was worn. Every movement of the boyar's arms would pull at the seams, and if they were not strong enough, the stitching could loosen over time. To prevent this, Ivan always reinforced the armholes with a second row of stitching, a technique that doubled the strength without adding bulk. He selected a finer needle from his felt roll, one with a slimmer curve and a smaller eye, and a spool of thinner linen thread that he waxed with a single pass across the block instead of the usual 3. The thinner thread would lie flatter against the leather, creating a second seam that was nearly invisible beneath the first. He began with the right armhole, positioning the cloak so that the curved edge lay flat on the table under the lamplight. The first row stitching was already in place, holding the front panel to the back along the arm's-eye curve, and now he worked a second row directly beside it, his needle entering the leather just a thread's width from the original stitches. The finer needle required an even lighter touch. The leather was soft enough to pierce easily, but the smallness of the needle meant that each stitch was delicate and precise. He worked slowly, placing each new stitch parallel to its predecessor, and the double thread formed a narrow band of reinforcement that would distribute the tension evenly along the entire curve. The work was tedious in its exactness, but Ivan approached it with the same calm patience he brought to every task. Each stitch was its own small world, contained and complete, and he gave it the full measure of his attention before moving on to the next. The needle dipped, the thread followed, the stitch seated itself in the leather, and then the cycle repeated, unhurried and steady, while the stove hummed and the oil lamp flickered with a gentle, golden light. The winter storm of the previous day had passed, but the cold remained absolute, and the workshop felt suspended in a pocket of warmth and quiet that made the outside world seem very far away. Misha arrived partway through the morning, stomping the snow from his boots in the doorway before entering. He carried a small bundle wrapped in a few pieces of dried apple that the boyar's cook had given him as a treat, and he set them on the corner of the table for later. After warming his hands at the stove, he took his place on the low stool and surveyed the workshop to see what needed doing. Ivan, without looking up from his stitching, gestured toward a pile of sable scraps that still needed combing for the collar trim, and Misha fetched the wooden comb and settled into the familiar rhythm of drawing the fur through the beechwood teeth. The soft rustle of the comb joined the whisper of Ivan's needle, and the morning deepened into its quiet fullness. The reinforcement of the right armhole took the better part of an hour, each careful stitch added to the one before until the entire curve was doubled. When Ivan finished, he ran the bone folder over the second row of stitches to flatten them, then turned the cloak fur side out to inspect the armhole from the outside. The fur lay thick and even around the opening, and when he pushed his hand through the armhole and moved his arm in a slow circle, the seam held without pulling or straining. He repeated the motion several times, watching the way the leather flexed and the fur shifted, and only when he was entirely satisfied did he set the cloak down and prepare to reinforce the left armhole. The left side required the same meticulous attention, the same fine needle and thin thread, the same slow procession of stitches along the curve. Ivan's posture at the table remained unchanged, his back bent slightly, his left hand steadying the leather, his right hand guiding the needle with the ease of decades of practice. The lamplight caught the silver tips of the sable fur where the cloak draped over the edge of the table, making them shimmer like a dusting of frost, and the scent of beeswax and birch smoke lingered in the warm air. Misha, having finished combing one batch of scraps, broke off a piece of dried apple and chewed it slowly, the faint sweetness a small pleasure in the long, cold day. Afternoon arrived without any visible change in the light, for the window remained a solid white square, and the sun was merely a pale suggestion behind the clouds. Ivan completed the left armhole reinforcement and straightened his back with a soft sigh, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness between them. He set the fine needle aside and returned to the regular curved needle, for the next task was to begin attaching the front panels to the back along the side seams, the long vertical joins that would run from the armhole down to the hem. These seams would complete the main body of the cloak, and once they were done, only the sleeves, collar, and lining would remain. He positioned the right side seam first, aligning the front and back panels along their long straight edges, and placed the iron weights at intervals to hold the leather in place. The seam was longer than the shoulder seams, running nearly the full length of the cloak, and it would require many stitches. Ivan began at the top, just under the armhole, and worked downward in his steady rhythm. Pierce, pull, tighten. Pierce, pull, tighten. The needle travelled along the seam line with the same unhurried pace it had followed for every other join, and the stitches accumulated in a neat, even row. Every so often he paused to lift the cloak and let it drape, checking that the front panel hung straight and that no twisting had crept into the seam, and each time he found the line true and the nap flowing correctly. The weight of the sable continued to impress itself upon him as he worked. Each time he lifted the cloak, he felt its density, the way the fur and leather combined into something substantial and serious. It was not a garment for a frivolous occasion. It was a cloak for a man of standing, a boyar who would wear it through council meetings and winter journeys, and it carried within its folds the patient labor of many hours. Ivan smoothed the fur with a gentle hand before laying it down again, and the gesture was almost tender, a craftsman's respect for the thing he was making. The right side seam reached its end at the hem, and Ivan tied off the thread, snicked the excess, and moved immediately to the left side. He worked the left seam with the same care, the same periodic checks of the drape, the same burnishing with the bone folder along each completed section. By the time the left seam was finished, the main body of the cloak was fully assembled, and what had once been a collection of flat pelts now had form and shape, a recognizable garment waiting to be completed. He hung the cloak on the wooden peg to let it rest while he took a brief pause, and he stood beside the stove, warming his hands and gazing at the cloak with a quiet, appraising eye. Misha had finished all the combing and was now practicing his stitching on a fresh scrap of leather, using the blunt needle and waxed thread that Yvonne had given him the night before. His stitches were growing more even, the spacing more consistent, and he worked with a focused expression that mirrored his master's. The workshop held its peace, the stove's warmth cocooning the room, the frost still thick on the window, and the winter afternoon slowly mellowing toward evening. Ivan drank a cup of lukewarm meadow-sweet tea that Misha had prepared, then returned to the table to inspect the armholes one final time, running a fingertip over the double seams and finding them firm and smooth. The day's work had brought the cloak into a new stage of wholeness, and though much remained to be done, the shape of the finished garment was now plainly visible. Ivan covered the cloak with the linen cloth, leaving it to hang on the peg, and tidied the table with the same slow, methodical movements that opened every day. He wiped the needles, coiled the thread, extinguished one of the oil lamps, and banked the stove with a thick birch log. Outside, the great frost of 1708 continued its silent reign. But inside the small workshop on Varvaka Street, the quiet rhythm of patient craft held steady against the cold, and the cloak rested in the darkness, waiting for morning. The sleeves of the boyar's cloak required a different approach from the large flat panels of the body, for an arm is not a static thing. It bends and reaches and lifts throughout the day, and the fur that covers it must move with these motions without binding or pulling. Ivan understood this from long experience, and on the 7th morning he turned his attention to the 8 pelts he had set aside for this purpose, the ones with the softest leather and the densest underfur. These pelts were slightly smaller than those used for the back, their shapes more irregular from the natural contours of the animals, but they were ideally suited for the task because the leather would flex easily, and the thickness of the fur would trap warmth around the boyar's arms even in the deepest cold. He cleared the work table of everything except the sleeve pelts and his tools, spreading a fresh square of linen over the surface to keep the fur clean. The 8 pelts lay before him in 2 groups of 4, each group destined to form one sleeve, and he checked the pale blue guide stitches that marked which pelt belonged to the left sleeve and which to the right. The taper would start wide at the shoulder, where the sleeve would join the generous armscye opening and narrow gradually to the cuff, a shape that Ivan had refined over many years to allow the greatest freedom while wasting as little of the precious fur as possible. He took up his charcoal stick and hempen string and began to mark the cutting lines directly onto the leather side of each pelt, drawing a long, gentle slope from the rounded shoulder cap to the straighter line at the wrist. The charcoal whispered across the leather, and the lines appeared dark and sure, mapping out 4 pieces for the left sleeve and 4 for the right. Each piece was a tapered section that, when sewn edge to edge, would form a tube that followed the natural narrowing of the animal's body, the fur flowing downward from shoulder to wrist in an unbroken stream. Ivan checked the nap direction on every piece before he cut, running his thumb along the hair to confirm that the silvery tips all pointed the same way, and only when he was satisfied did he reach for the round knife and begin the long, careful process of freeing the shapes from the surrounding leather. The knife moved through the soft pelts with very little resistance, parting the pale skin in smooth, sighing strokes that seemed to belong to the quiet of the morning. He cut around the curves of the shoulder caps first, tilting the blade to follow the arc, then along the straight edges that would become the seams joining the sections together. The offcuts fell into a pile on the side, small crescents and triangles of sable that Misha would later collect for the ever-growing basket of scraps. When all 8 pieces were cut, Ivan burnished their edges with the bone folder in long, firm passes that flattened any roughness and prepared the leather to receive the needle, and the pieces lay on the linen like dark petals waiting to be assembled into a flower. Sewing the sleeves into tubes was a repetitive task, but it demanded constant attention to the tension of each stitch. A sleeve seam pulled too tight would create a stiff ridge that the boyar would feel against his arm, while a seam too loose would gape and let the cold creep in. Ivan threaded a fresh needle with waxed linen thread and began with the left sleeve, taking up 2 of the tapered sections and aligning their edges with the small iron weights. He worked the first seam from the shoulder end to the cuff, his needle dipping and rising in the steady rhythm that had become as natural to him as breathing, each stitch placed with precisely the same spacing as its neighbor. The leather yielded softly, and the waxed thread seated itself in the tiny holes with a faint, satisfying grip, drawing the pieces together into a smooth curve. After the first seam, he picked up the 3rd section and attached it to the growing tube, then the 4th, until the left sleeve lay on the table as a single piece, its shape a long, tapered cone of fur and leather. He turned it carefully fur side out, pushing his hand gently into the tube from the wide end, and the dark sable bloomed under the lamplight, the glossy guard hairs springing outward and the silver tips shimmering as his fingers moved inside. The sleeve was warm immediately, the dense underfur trapping his body heat and sending a soft, pleasant sensation up his arm, and for a moment he simply held his hand there, feeling the weight and the warmth. Then he withdrew his arm and laid the sleeve aside, for the cloak was not his to wear, and he had the right sleeve still to make. The process for the right sleeve mirrored the left exactly, with the same cutting, the same burnishing, the same slow assembly of sections into a tube. Ivan's hands moved through the familiar motions without hesitation, but also without hurry, respecting the work enough to give each stitch its due. The morning passed in this way, the stove humming its low song and the frost on the window maintaining its solid white vigil, and by the time the pale light outside began its slow shift toward midday, both sleeves lay finished on the table, their fur glossy and their seams invisible from the outside. He hung them on a smaller peg beside the main body of the cloak, where they dangled like the limbs of a sleeping creature, and he stepped back to survey the growing garment with a quiet, measured gaze. The days in the workshop were measured not by clocks, but by the gradual completion of tasks, and on this day the early darkness of winter arrived well before the work was done. The window, which had been a soft white square all morning, slowly deepened to a cool grey and then to a dull blue, the light withdrawing almost imperceptibly until Ivan realized he was squinting at his needle and rose to light the second oil lamp. The twin flames pushed the shadows back and cast a warm, steady glow over the table, and he resumed his place on the stool, now turning to the task of attaching the sleeves to the body of the cloak. This part of the work required him to match the wide shoulder cap of each sleeve to the arm-side opening he had reinforced 2 days earlier. The curve of the sleeve cap was slightly larger than the curve of the armhole, a deliberate fullness that would create a gentle ease in the shoulder, allowing the boyar to raise his arms without the whole cloak pulling upward. Ivan pinned the right sleeve into position with a series of small bone splinters that he kept in a clay jar, their points sharpened to hold the leather without tearing it, and he adjusted the alignment several times, stepping back and sighting along the curve before he was satisfied with the set. The sleeve angled slightly forward from the shoulder, anticipating the natural posture of a standing man, a small refinement that would make the cloak hang correctly whether the boyar stood still or walked. With the sleeve pinned, Ivan began stitching the curved seam, working his needle through the 3 layers of leather: the front panel, the back panel, and the sleeve cap, with the same care he had given every other join. The curve required him to adjust his stitch angle continuously, tilting the needle to enter the leather at the proper shallow slant, and he did this without breaking his rhythm, his hands moving in a slow, practiced dance. The thread pulled through, the seams came together, the bone splinters were removed one by one as the stitching reached them, and gradually the right sleeve became a permanent part of the cloak. When the seam was done, he turned the garment first side out and fluffed the shoulder join with his fingertips, hiding the stitches beneath the thick sable hair until the transition from body to sleeve was seamless. Outside, the brief afternoon had already faded, and the evening settled over Moscow with a deep, absolute darkness that the cold seemed to intensify. Ivan and Misha paused their work as the stove began to burn low, and the boy rose to prepare their simple evening meal. From a covered pot kept warm on the stove's flat top, Misha ladled out a hot broth made from dried mushrooms and root vegetables, the steam rising in fragrant curls that mixed with the ever-present scent of birch smoke. He set out 2 wooden bowls on the corner of the table, adding a thick slice of black bread to each, and a small mound of pickled cabbage that glistened with brine. The 2 of them ate in silence as they always did, the spoons clinking softly against the bowls and the bread tearing easily under their fingers. The broth was savory and warming, the cabbage sharp and crisp, and the meal, though simple, filled the stomach and chased away the chill that had crept into their bones during the long hours of seated work. Outside the window, the dark pressed close and cold, but inside the workshop the lamplight held everything in a gentle amber embrace. After supper, Ivan wiped his bowl clean with a scrap of bread and chewed it slowly, then rose and walked to the woodpile in the corner. The stack of split birch logs was running low, and he would need more before the night was through. He pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, wrapped a woolen scarf around his neck, and pushed open the heavy door that led to the small courtyard behind the workshop. A wall of cold met him instantly, so sharp and penetrating that it seemed to push against his chest, and his breath turned to white plumes that hung in the still air before dissipating. The snow in the courtyard was knee-deep and crusted over with a hard, glittering shell, and his felt boots crunched through the surface with a sound like grinding glass as he made his way to the wood store, a low lean-to attached to the back wall. He gathered an armful of split birch logs, the bark peeling away in papery curls, and as he straightened up with the load, he allowed himself a moment to look at the sky. The night above Moscow was a deep velvet black, scattered with stars so sharp and numerous that they seemed to vibrate in the cold. Each point of light was needle-bright, the air so frozen and clear that the stars did not twinkle, but burned steadily, and a thin sliver of moon hung low in the east, its crescent as fine as a paring of silver. The rooftops around the courtyard were piled with thick caps of snow, the chimneys silent and smokeless at this hour, and the city lay in a profound stillness, not a voice or a footstep or a dog's bark to be heard. Ivan stood for a long moment with the wood in his arms, his face lifted to the sky, the cold biting at his cheeks while the stars stared back, and then he turned and crunched his way across the courtyard, his footprints marking the fresh snow with a series of deep blue shadows. Back inside, he kicked the door shut with his heel and crossed to the stove, where he added 2 logs to the glowing embers and watched the flames catch with a soft whoosh before he removed his coat and scarf. The warmth of the workshop wrapped around him again, welcome and familiar, and he stood by the stove until the cold had left his skin and his fingers were supple enough to resume the needle. Misha had cleared away the bowls and was now sitting on his stool with a practice scrap, quietly stitching a running seam along its edge, his eyes half-lidded with the drowsiness that came from a full stomach and the late hour. Ivan returned to the table and took up the cloak once more, this time turning his attention to the left sleeve. The process of pinning, adjusting, and stitching was repeated with the same unhurried care as the right, the bone splinters holding the sleeve cap in place while he sighted along the curve and made small corrections to the set. The left sleeve went in at the same slight forward angle, matching its partner, and the needle began its slow journey around the armscye, joining leather to leather with a steady, rhythmic piercing that had marked every seam of the garment. As he worked, the night deepened beyond the frosted window, and the silence of the city was so complete that the only sounds in the workshop were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the needle, and the soft, even breathing of the 2 workers. When the final stitch of the left sleeve seam was tied off and the bone splinters removed, Ivan let out a slow breath and set the needle down on the table. He lifted the cloak by the shoulders and let it hang from his raised hands, while he took several steps back, surveying the garment as a whole for the first time since the sleeves had been attached. The cloak now hung almost complete, its back and front panels joined, its shoulders strong, its sleeves falling in smooth tapered lines from the wide arm size to the narrow cuffs. The fur gleamed under the double lamplight, a deep dark brown with its silver tipping catching the glow like frost on a forest floor, and the seams were nowhere to be seen. All that remained was the standing collar to shield the boyar's neck, the indigo wool lining to cover the leather inside, and the horn toggles and loops that would close the front. And then the work of many days would reach its quiet end. He hung the cloak carefully on the large wooden peg, spreading the sleeves so that they would not crease, and stepped back to look at it once more. The garment seemed almost alive in the dim workshop, a heavy, warm presence that filled the space with a sense of patient completion. Misha looked up from his stitching and followed his master's gaze, and even the boy, young as he was, could see that the cloak was nearly finished. Ivan gave a small nod, more to himself than to anyone else, and then began the nightly ritual of tidying the workshop. He wiped the needle with a drop of oil, coiled the remaining thread, covered the scraps, and banked the stove with a thick birch log that would burn slowly until morning. The second lamp was extinguished, and the first turned down to a low, amber flicker, and the workshop settled into the soft darkness that preceded sleep. Misha pulled on his heavy coat and boots, the same quiet routine as every evening, and slipped out into the frozen night with the practice scrap tucked into his pocket. Ivan stood alone in the workshop for a while longer, listening to the frost creak in the rafters and the stove tick as it cooled, and his eyes rested on the hanging cloak. The great frost of 1708 held Moscow in its unrelenting grip, But inside this small room on Varvaka Street, a garment had taken shape that could stand against the cold for many winters to come. The stars outside remained sharp and bright, the sliver of moon climbed higher, and the city slept beneath its blanket of ice while the cloak waited, patient and still, for the final touches that would bring it to completion. The standing collar was the part of the cloak that would rise against the boyar's neck and ears, shielding them from the wind that swept across the frozen Moskva River and through the narrow streets of Moscow. And on the 8th morning, Ivan turned his full attention to its construction. The collar required a different character of fur than the body or the sleeves. It needed to be dense enough to block the bitterest drafts, yet soft enough to brush against the skin without irritation, and it needed to hold its shape when lifted upright rather than flopping forward or sagging backward. From the very beginning of the project, Ivan had set aside a special reserve of the smallest and silkiest pelts for this purpose, and now he brought them forward, spreading them on the work table under the lamplight, while the stove warmed the room with its steady, ruddy glow. The fur for the collar was drawn from the trimmed scraps of the largest pelts and supplemented with a few small, jewel-like sables that had been too short for the body panels but were perfect for this single, crucial task. Ivan sorted through the pieces with patient fingers, holding each one up to the light to examine the silver tipping, which was finer and more delicate on these pelts than on any others in the collection. The guard hairs shimmered with an almost blue cast, a sign of exceptional quality, and the underwool was so thick and soft that when he pressed his thumb into it, the indentation lingered for a moment before the fur slowly regained its fullness. He selected the best pieces and arranged them on the table, their edges overlapping slightly, and then he took up the charcoal and the hempen string to sketch the collar pattern directly onto the leather. The shape of the collar was a gentle horseshoe, wider at the center back where it would rise behind the boyar's head and tapering gradually toward the front where it would meet the closure of the cloak. The curve was not a simple arc. It had to follow the natural oval of a human neck, while allowing enough room for the thick wool of a winter kaftan that the boyar would wear underneath, and Ivan had drawn this same pattern many times over the years, each time adjusting it slightly to fit the specific measurements of the client. He consulted the birch bark strip pinned to the wall, noting the neck circumference that the boyar steward had provided, and then traced the charcoal along the hempen string in a smooth, unhurried line. The curve appeared on the leather like a dark ribbon, and he checked it twice against the measurement before nodding to himself and reaching for the round knife. Cutting the collar pieces was delicate work because the pelts were so small and the curve so tight, requiring him to tilt the blade at sharper angles than he had used for the broad expanses of the back panel. He made the first incision at the top of the horseshoe and guided the knife along the charcoal with short, controlled strokes, letting the blade find its own path through the soft leather while his left hand held the pelt steady. The pieces fell free one by one, and he burnished their edges with the bone folder until they were smooth and flat, then arranged them on the table in the order they would be sewn: a central back piece, two side pieces, and two small front tabs that would tuck behind the closure toggles. Before the pieces could be stitched together, the collar needed a foundation, an inner layer that would give it the stiffness to stand upright without becoming rigid or uncomfortable. For this, Ivan selected a strip of fine hemp canvas that he kept in a drawer beneath the work table, a material he had prepared himself by soaking the fibers and beating them soft against a stone. The canvas was pale tan in color, lightweight but strong, and it had just enough body to hold a curve when bent. He cut it to the same horseshoe shape as the collar, adding an extra finger's width of seam allowance on all sides, and then laid it flat on the table with the sable pieces arranged on top, fur side down, so that the leather would be sewn directly to the canvas. Threading a fresh needle with wax linen thread, Ivan began to assemble the collar from the inside out. He first stitched the individual sable pieces together along their curved edges, joining the center back to the sides and the sides to the front tabs, using the same Furrier's whip stitch that had served him throughout the project. The tiny seams came together under his patient fingers, and the bone folder pressed them flat after every few stitches, burnishing the leather to a soft sheen and ensuring that no ridge would show through to the fur side. When the sable shell was complete, he laid it over the hemp canvas and began the slow process of attaching the two layers together, his needle dipping through the leather and the canvas with a slightly firmer push than before, for the canvas offered more resistance than sable skin. The stitching that joined the sable to the canvas ran along the outer edge of the collar, and then in a series of parallel rows across the body of the curve, like the ribs of a leaf, each row a finger's width apart. This quilting held the fur and the foundation in a close, permanent embrace, and it also created subtle channels in the leather that would help the collar hold its upright shape when worn. Ivan worked the rows one by one, his needle traveling in straight, even lines from the outer edge to the inner neckline, and the waxed thread sank into the canvas with a soft, satisfying grip that spoke of strength and durability. The bone folder burnished each row flat, and by the time the last stitch was tied off, the collar had become a substantial, shaped piece that could stand on its own when propped on the table. He turned the collar fur side out and examined it with a critical eye. The sable gleamed under the lamplight, the silver tips catching the glow in a fine, even shimmer that ran around the entire curve without any interruption. The hemp canvas inside gave the collar a gentle firmness. When he pressed the center back with his palm, the curve held, and when he released it, the collar sprang back to its original shape without any sign of collapse. He lifted it to his own neck and held it there for a moment, testing the fit against his skin, and the fur was soft and warm, and the horseshoe curve wrapped naturally from the sides of his throat to the back of his neck. Once again he reminded himself that the cloak was not his to keep, and he set the collar down on the table with a small, private sigh. Now came the task of attaching the collar to the body of the cloak, a step that required particular patience, because the curve of the collar had to match the curve of the neckline exactly, and any misalignment would create puckers or gaps that the boyar would feel every time he turned his head. Ivan lifted the cloak from the wooden peg and brought it to the table, spreading the neckline flat and smoothing the fur back from the leather edge, so that he could work without catching the guard hairs in his stitches. The neckline was a compound curve, dipping slightly at the front where the cloak would open and rising at the back to cradle the base of the skull, and the collar had been shaped to follow this same contour, but matching the two curves in practice always required small adjustments. He pinned the collar into position using a dozen of his bone splinters, their sharpened points slipping through the leather without tearing it, and their pale shafts standing upright like a tiny fence along the neckline. With the first pin in place at the center back, he worked outward toward the front on each side, pressing the collar and the neckline together between his fingers, checking the alignment, inserting a pin, and then stepping back to sight along the curve. Several times he removed a pin and shifted the collar by a hair's width, adjusting the set until the two curves lay together in perfect harmony, the collar rising from the neckline at exactly the angle he wanted, neither leaning too far back, which would let the wind slip in, nor pitching too far forward, which would press against the boyar's throat. When the pinning was complete, he threaded a new needle and began the long, careful seam that would make the collar a permanent part of the cloak. The stitch was the same whip stitch he had used everywhere else, but he worked it even more slowly here, placing each stitch with deliberate precision, because the collar seam would be subject to constant flexing as the boyar moved his head, and would need to hold firm for many years. The needle pierced through the leather of the collar, the leather of the neckline, and the thin edge of the hemp canvas, pulling the three layers together with the steady, measured tension that Ivan had perfected over decades. Each stitch seated itself neatly beside its neighbor, and the thread disappeared into the leather, leaving only a tiny, regular dimple to mark its passage. He sewed the entire neckline seam in a single session, working from the center back around to the right front, then returning to the center back and working around to the left front, his needle traveling the full horseshoe curve without pause. The bone splinters were removed one by one as the stitching reached them, set back into the clay jar for future use, and the collar slowly became inseparable from the body of the cloak. When the last stitch was tied off and the thread snipped, Ivan lifted the cloak by the collar and let the full weight of the garment hang beneath it. The seam held without straining, and the collar stood proud and straight above the fall of fur. The afternoon had grown deep and quiet by the time Ivan set down his needle and stretched his shoulders, and it was into this quiet that a knock at the door sounded, a short, firm rapping that made Misha look up from his corner stool. Ivan wiped his hands on his apron and crossed to the door, lifting the heavy latch and pulling it inward to admit a gust of frozen air and a stocky man in a thick wool coat and felt boots whose face was reddened by the cold. This was the boyar's steward, the same man who had delivered the cedar box of sable pelts on the first evening, and he stamped the snow from his feet before stepping fully inside and pulling off his mittens to warm his hands at the stove. The steward was a practical man with a short grey beard and deep-set eyes, and he did not waste words on pleasantries. He had come on behalf of the boyar to inquire about the progress of the cloak, and his gaze moved around the workshop with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to overseeing many tasks at once. Ivan nodded toward the wooden peg where the cloak hung, its dark fur gleaming in the lamplight, the collar now attached and the sleeves falling in their smooth, tapered lines, the whole garment nearly complete. The steward walked over and looked at the cloak without touching it, his eyes travelling from the standing collar down to the hem and back up again, and after a long moment he made a small sound of approval deep in his throat. He did not say much, but his expression softened and the slight tension in his shoulders eased, and he asked no further questions about the schedule or the quality. The steward stayed only a few minutes, warming himself by the stove and exchanging a handful of quiet words with Ivan about the weather and the condition of the roads, which were nearly impassable in places. No payment changed hands, for the agreement was that the full sum would be delivered upon the final fitting, and the steward was not the type to settle accounts before the work was complete. He pulled on his mittens, nodded once more at the cloak, and ducked out into the cold, the door closing behind him with a solid thump that echoed briefly in the rafters before the workshop settled back into its familiar stillness. When the steward had gone, Ivan returned to the table and took up the collar once more, for there was still a final row of stitching to be done. The inner edge of the collar, the part that would rest directly against the boyar's neck, needed to be finished with a row of tiny blind stitches that would secure the sable to the hemp canvas without any thread showing on the inside of the cloak. He selected his thinnest needle and a length of unusually fine thread that he had waxed with a single light pass, and he bent low over the collar in the lamplight, working the needle into the leather at a glancing angle so that it caught only the surface fibers and did not pierce through to the fur side. The blind stitches were almost invisible even to his own practiced eye, a ghostly line of tiny dimples that held the layers together without calling attention to themselves, and he sewed them with the same unhurried concentration he had given every other step. Misha, who had been sweeping the floor and tidying the woodpile, returned to his stool and took up a practice scrap, sewing his own small running stitches while the evening settled in around them. The lamp burned steadily, the stove murmured its low, warm song, and the frost on the window had grown so thick that it now resembled a sheet of milky ice with no hint of the dark street beyond. Ivan completed the blind stitching on the inner collar and then ran the bone folder one final time along the neckline seam, pressing it flat with long, firm strokes that sealed the wax thread into the leather and left a subtle, polished sheen. The collar stood upright when he propped it with his hand, and it curved gently inward when he released it, falling into exactly the shape that would embrace the boyar's neck. He hung the cloak back on the large wooden peg and stepped away to look at it, his eyes travelling over the completed body, the attached sleeves, and the new standing collar that rose from the neckline like a dark crown. The garment was now missing only its lining and its closures, and it hung there with a presence that seemed to fill the room, a weight of fur and craftsmanship that had absorbed many days of patient labour. Ivan's face showed no strong emotion, for he was not a man given to outward displays, but something in the way he stood, the slight relaxation of his shoulders and the calm steadiness of his breath, spoke of a quiet satisfaction that ran deep. The night outside was utterly still, the great frost holding Moscow in its crystalline grip, but inside the small workshop on Varvaka Street, the stove glowed and the lamp flickered, and the cloak waited on its peg like a living thing at rest. Ivan and Misha tidied the room together, sweeping the leather scraps into their basket, wiping the tools with oil, banking the fire with a thick birch log that would smoulder until morning. The boy pulled on his heavy coat and slipped out into the darkness with a murmured word, and Ivan stood alone for a while, listening to the creak of the frost in the rafters and gazing up the cloak that he had nearly finished. The standing collar rose dark and proud against the lamplight, and the fur shimmered with its silver tips, and all that remained were the final touches that would turn this garment from a work of art into a warm embrace against the deepest winter cold. The indigo wool cloth arrived at the workshop on the 9th morning, carried not by the boyar's steward this time, but by a younger servant who knocked softly and handed the bundle through the door without stepping inside, eager to retreat from the cold. Ivan untied the linen wrapping and unrolled the fabric across the swept floor of the workshop, where it spread like a pool of deep twilight blue, the color of the sky just before the last light fades. The wool was heavy and finely woven, its surface smooth to the touch, with a slight nap that caught the lamplight in soft, velvety ripples, and it smelled faintly of the fuller's earth and the dye vats where it had been treated. Ivan knelt beside it and ran his palm across the cloth in long, slow strokes, checking the weave for any thin spots or pulled threads, but the fabric was flawless, the product of skilled hands working at a loom somewhere far from the frozen streets of Moscow. He let the wool rest on the floor for a while to acclimate to the warmth of the workshop, while he prepared his tools at the table, threading a fresh needle with a new length of waxed linen thread, and setting out the bone folder, the measure cord, and the iron scissors. The task of lining the cloak was different in character from the work that had come before. The sewing would be quicker because the wool was easier to pierce than leather, and the stitches did not need to be invisible from the outside. But the cutting required great care because the lining pieces had to match the sable pieces exactly while allowing a small extra margin for ease. If the lining was cut too small, the cloak would pull and bunch. If too large, it would sag and wrinkle inside the fur and create an uncomfortable lump against the boyar's back. Ivan lifted the finished sable cloak from its wooden peg and laid it on the table with the leather side facing up, spreading the front panels, back and sleeves so that the whole inner surface was exposed. The pale leather gleamed under the lamplight like old parchment, marked here and there by the tiny dimples of the stitching and the darker spots where the animals had once healed from small scratches. He then took up a fresh length of coarse linen, the same material he had used for the original pattern, and began to trace the shape of the cloak's interior directly onto it, using a stick of charcoal to outline each section. The large back piece, the two mirrored front panels, the sleeve interiors, and the narrow strip that would cover the inside of the standing collar. The charcoal whispered across the linen, and the lines appeared one by one, mapping the inner geography of the garment so that the wool could be cut with precision. When the tracing was complete, he laid the indigo wool flat on the floor and positioned the linen pattern pieces on top of it, weighting them down with the small iron discs. The heavy wool cloth resisted the scissors slightly as he began to cut, the blades parting the fibers with a crisp, clean sound that was different from the soft sigh of leather under the round knife. He added an extra finger's width to every edge as he cut, a seam allowance that would let the lining move independently of the sable so that the two layers could shift against each other without straining the stitches. The offcuts of blue wool fell aside in neat, angular pieces that Misha would later collect and save, for wool of this quality was too valuable to waste and could be used to line mittens or pad the shoulders of a lesser garment. One by one, the lining pieces took shape on the floor. The broad back panel, the two front panels with their gentle neckline curves, the sleeve linings cut in the same tapered shape as the sable sleeves, and the small horseshoe piece for the collar. Ivan lifted each piece and shook it gently to remove any loose fibers, then carried them to the table and laid them over the corresponding sections of the cloak, checking the fit with a careful eye. The indigo wool contrasted beautifully with the pale leather, and the two layers together, the deep blue cloth and the cream-colored skin, looked almost like a finished garment already, though many stitches still lay ahead. Attaching the lining began at the hem, the long straight edge at the bottom of the cloak where the wool would be folded under, and sewn to the leather with a loose catch stitch that allowed for gentle movement. Ivan threaded his needle and knelt beside the table so that his eyes were level with the hem, working the stitch with a slow, even rhythm. A small bite of leather, a small bite of wool, the thread crossing between them in a diagonal pattern that held the two layers together without pulling them tight. The catch stitch was a forgiving stitch, one that allowed the heavy fur and the wool lining to settle into their own natural relationship rather than binding them rigidly, and Ivan spaced each stitch a thumb's width apart so that the seam would breathe. The needle moved through the wool with very little resistance, the wax thread gliding through the soft fibers, and the hem slowly came together in a neat, regular line of pale stitches against the deep blue cloth. From the hem he moved upward, working along the front edges where the cloak would close over the boyar's chest, and attaching the wool lining to the leather with the same loose, even stitch. The front edges needed to be particularly flat and smooth, because they would be visible each time the cloak was opened, and Ivan took his time here, burnishing the seam with the bone folder after every span and checking that the wool lay without wrinkles. He worked his way up the right front edge and then the left, pausing occasionally to smooth the lining with his palm and adjust the tension of a stitch that seemed slightly too tight. The indigo wool grew warm under his hands, and the cloak began to feel more substantial with each section of lining that was attached, its weight increasing and its inner surface transforming from raw leather into soft, finished cloth. Misha had arrived part-way through the morning, and seeing that the floor was occupied with the cutting of the lining, had taken his practice work to a small bench near the stove. He was now sewing a series of buttonholes onto a strip of scrap wool, learning the tight, circular stitch that would someday be required for closures on garments of his own making. His needle dipped and rose in a patient rhythm that echoed Ivan's, and the two of them worked in their shared silence while the stove hummed and the frost on the window held its solid white vigil. The sleeve linings came next and required a slightly different technique because the narrow tubes of wool had to be slipped inside the sable sleeves and attached at the cuff and the arm side without twisting. Ivan turned each wool sleeve piece inside out, then inserted it into the corresponding sable sleeve, so that the smooth side of the wool would rest against the boyar's arms while the seam allowance remained hidden between the layers. He reached into the sleeve with one hand, spreading his fingers to push the wool all the way to the shoulder cap, and then he smoothed and adjusted the fabric from the outside until the lining lay flat without any bunching. The cuff was sewn first, a neat circular seam that joined the wool to the leather at the wrist opening, and then the shoulder end was attached to the arm-size seam allowance with a series of small tidy stitches that reinforced the existing join. He repeated the process for the second sleeve, his arm disappearing into the dark tube of fur, his fingers working blind inside the narrow space. And when both sleeves were lined, he laid the cloak flat and ran his hands over the arms from shoulder to cuff, feeling the smooth transition from wool to fur and finding no puckers or gaps. Now the body of the lining had to be secured across its broad surfaces so that the wool would not billow away from the leather when the cloak was worn. Ivan achieved this with a series of tailor's tacks, loose stitches that passed through the wool and caught only the surface fibers of the leather without piercing all the way to the fur side. He spaced these tacks at intervals across the back panel and the front panels, working in a grid pattern that held the layers together lightly while still allowing the natural flex and drape of the fur. Each tack was a small, almost invisible dimple in the wool, a point of connection that would keep the lining in place for years without creating any stiffness, and he sewed them with a fine needle and a single strand of thread that was nearly the same deep blue as the cloth. With the lining fully attached, Ivan turned his attention to the closures at the front of the cloak. The boyar had requested a series of toggles and loops rather than buttons, a practical choice because toggles could be fastened even with cold stiffened fingers and would not pop free in a strong wind. From a small wooden box on the shelf, Ivan took out 5 polished horn toggles that he had carved himself many months earlier, each one about the length of a thumb joint and as thick as a finger. The horn was a warm, translucent brown with subtle streaks of cream running through it, and he had sanded each toggle smooth and carved a simple crosshatch pattern around its middle to give the leather loop something to grip. The toggles were cool and weighty in his palm, and he set them in a neat row on the table where they caught the lamplight with a soft, organic gleam. The toggles would be sewn to the right front edge of the cloak, and the corresponding loops would be attached to the left front edge. Ivan first positioned the toggles along the edge, spacing them evenly from the collar down to the chest, and marked each spot with a tiny charcoal dot. He then threaded a strong needle with a double length of waxed thread and began the work of attaching them, passing the needle through the small hole drilled into the end of each toggle, then through the leather and the wool lining, then back through the toggle, repeating this circuit 4 times for each piece until the horn was bound tightly to the cloak and would not wobble or twist. He tested each toggle by tugging it gently, and all 5 held as firm as if they had grown from the leather itself. The loops were made from braided leather strips that Ivan had prepared by cutting thin cords from a piece of sturdy cowhide and plaiting them into tight, springy lengths. He cut 5 loops, each one size to fit snugly over its corresponding toggle, and attached them to the left front edge with the same strong stitching, burying the ends of the leather under a small patch of wool lining so that no raw edges showed. When the last loop was sewn in place, he closed the front of the cloak and fastened each toggle through its loop, working from the collar down to the chest, and the closure held the heavy fur securely with no gaps. He unfastened the toggles one by one, the polished horn sliding smoothly through the leather loops, and then fastened them again, testing the ease of the motion, and each time the toggle seated itself with a quiet, satisfying click of horn against leather. The final piece of lining was the narrow strip that would cover the inside of the standing collar. Ivan cut a piece of the indigo wool to the same horseshoe shape, folded its edges under, and sewed it into place with a series of tiny blind stitches that were almost invisible against the dark blue cloth. The wool facing softened the collar's interior and would rest gently against the boyar's neck without chafing, and it also covered the raw edge of the hemp canvas so that the inside of the cloak was as finished and handsome as the outside. He burnished the collar lining flat with the bone folder and then lifted the cloak by the collar once more, letting the full weight hang while he inspected the closure, the lining, and the seams from every angle. The cloak was now complete. Ivan spread it fur side up on the table and took up a soft brush made from horsehair that he kept specifically for this final stage, a brush with long, flexible bristles that could coax the sable fur to its fullest glory without pulling or scratching. He brushed the entire cloak in slow, sweeping strokes, working from the standing collar down across the back panel and the front panels and along the sleeves. And as the brush traveled over the fur, the sable seemed to come alive under the lamplight. The guard hairs rose and settled into perfect alignment. The silver tips shimmered with a soft, even luster, and the underwool bloomed into a deep, plush thickness that made the cloak look almost like a living pelt. The brushing took a long time, for Ivan was thorough, and he went over each section multiple times until the fur was smooth and glossy and free of any loose fibers. When the brushing was done, he hung the cloak on the large wooden peg and stepped back to look at it. The garment hung there in its full, finished weight, the dark sable gleaming, the standing collar rising proud and straight, the sleeves falling in their smooth, tapered lines, the indigo lining visible only as a hint of deep blue at the hem and the front edges. The horn toggles glowed softly, and the braided leather loops lay flat against the fur, and the whole cloak seemed to possess a quiet, stately presence that filled the small workshop. Ivan's face remained calm, his expression unchanged, but his hands, which he clasped behind his back, were still and relaxed, and his breathing came slow and deep. A craftsman knows the feeling of work that has been done well, and that feeling requires no outward display. Misha rose from his stool and came to stand beside his master, looking at the cloak with wide eyes. He had watched the garment come together from a box of raw pelts to this finished thing of beauty, and the lesson of patience and care was written into every seam. Ivan said nothing, but after a moment he reached out and gestured toward the small basket of sable scraps that Misha had combed so carefully, the scraps that had been set aside at the very beginning. Some of the best pieces were still there, the ones with the finest silver tipping and the softest leather, and Ivan nodded toward them, a silent permission for the boy to use them for his own practice. Misha understood and carried the basket back to his stool, holding one of the precious scraps in his palm, and turning it over with a new kind of respect. The afternoon had long since faded into evening, and the workshop was lit only by the 2 oil lamps and the soft glow of the stove. Ivan tidied the table for the night, wiping the tools with oil, coiling the remaining thread, and sweeping the small blue snips of wool from the floor. He banked the fire with a thick birch log, and the flames settled into a low, steady smolder that would keep the room warm until morning. The frost on the window was as thick as ever, a solid white wall that sealed the workshop off from the frozen city outside, and the silence of the great frost lay over everything like a heavy blanket. Ivan stood for a while in the quiet, his eyes resting on the finished cloak, and the workshop held its peace around him. The work of many days complete at last, the boyar's cloak ready for whatever winter winds would come. The morning of the delivery arrived with a sky the color of pearl, pale and even and soft, as though the great frost had finally gentled its grip just enough to allow the city to draw a quiet breath. In the workshop on Varvaka Street, Ivan rose earlier than usual, his movements unhurried but purposeful, and after kindling the stove to a steady warmth, he went directly to the large wooden peg where the finished cloak hung in its full dark glory. The sable fur gleamed under the lamplight with a deep, rich luster. the silver tips catching the glow in a fine, even shimmer that ran from the standing collar down to the hem, and the indigo lining showed as a subtle hint of blue at the front edges and the cuffs. He stood before it for a moment, letting his eyes travel over every seam and every panel, a final silent inspection before the garment left his hands forever. He took down the horsehair brush from its hook on the wall, the same soft bristled brush he had used the evening before, and began to work it over the cloak one last time. The brush travelled in long, sweeping strokes that started at the standing collar and moved downward across the back, following the natural flow of the nap, and then along the sleeves from shoulder to cuff, and then across the front panels with their gentle curves and their polished horn toggles. The bristles coaxed the guard hairs into perfect alignment, and any stray fluff or dust that had settled overnight lifted away and floated into the lamplight before vanishing. Ivan brushed with the same patient thoroughness he had given every step of the process, turning the cloak slightly on its peg to reach the sides and the inner folds. And when he was done, the fur looked almost impossibly smooth, a single unbroken surface of glossy darkness that seemed to absorb the light and give it back as a soft, silver-edged glow. With the brushing complete, he lifted the cloak from the peg and carried it to the work table, where a large square of unbleached linen waited to serve as a wrapping cloth. He spread the linen flat and then folded the cloak with great care, turning the fur inward so that the sable would be protected during the short journey through the frozen streets. The sleeves laid straight along the body and the collar supported so it would not crease. The folded cloak made a substantial bundle, heavy and dense, and he wrapped the linen around it with the clean, precise folds of a man who had done this many times before, tucking the corners under and securing everything with a length of twine tied in a simple, reliable knot. The bundle sat on the table like a precious parcel, unmarked and unadorned, its value hidden beneath the plain cloth. Misha arrived through the back door just as Ivan was tying the final knot, his cheeks red from the cold and his felt boots leaving small clumps of snow on the threshold. He saw the wrapped bundle immediately, and understood that this was the day the cloak would leave them, and a quiet solemnity settled over his young features. Without being asked, he fetched Ivan's heavy sheepskin coat and his woolen scarf and mittens, laying them on the stool near the stove so they would warm before the walk, and then he put on his own outer garments with the practiced speed of a boy accustomed to the cold. Ivan said nothing, but he nodded at Misha in the way that dispensed with words, and the boy picked up the wrapped bundle and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of the finished cloak through the linen. The two of them stepped out of the workshop and into the frozen world beyond the door. The air struck them with a sharp, crystalline clarity that made the eyes water and the breath turn to white plumes. But the wind had died down in the night, and the cold was a still, silent presence rather than a biting assault. The snow in the street was packed hard as stone by weeks of sled runners and trampling feet, and their boots crunched over the surface with a sound like grinding salt, while the buildings on either side rose in frost-covered walls whose logs had contracted in the cold to leave thin gaps sealed with ice. The sky overhead was the same pale pearl as before, and the sun, still hidden behind a high veil of cloud, cast a diffuse, shadowless light that made the whole city look like a painting rendered in shades of white and grey. They walked along Varvaka Street toward the centre of the city, Misha carrying the bundle and Ivan walking slightly ahead with his hands tucked into the opposite sleeves of his coat. The street was nearly empty, and the few figures they passed a woman drawing water from a communal well, an old man feeding birch bark to a small fire, a pair of bundled children dragging a sled moved slowly and quietly, their voices muted by the cold and their shapes indistinct in the pale light. The bells of the nearby churches were silent, their clappers still frozen fast, and the only sounds were the crunch of footsteps and the occasional creak of a roof beam settling under its load of snow. The Moskva River, visible in glimpses between the buildings, was a broad white plain whose ice lay so thick that sledges crossed it without leaving tracks, and the far bank was lost in a haze of frost. They passed the Grand Market, which in warmer months would have been a riot of colour and noise and the shouts of merchants, but which now stood nearly deserted under its wooden arcades. A few stalls had been set up despite the cold, their owners stamping their feet and clapping their mittened hands, while small braziers burned with weak, smoky flames, and the goods on display were mostly winter staples, bundles of dried fish, sacks of rye flour, clay pots of pickled vegetables, and piles of felt boots. No one called out to the two figures walking past, and Ivan did not slow his pace, his eyes fixed on the route ahead, while Misha followed with the bundle clutched to his chest as though it were the most precious thing in the world. The boyar's house stood near the Kitai-Gorod wall, a substantial stone building of 2 floors with a steep roof and a row of small windows whose panes glowed faintly with the light of fires within. Its walls were thick and solid, built to withstand sieges and winters alike, and the snow in the courtyard had been swept into neat piles that flanked the heavy oak door. Ivan approached the door and lifted the iron knocker, a ring held in the mouth of a bronze lion, and let it fall once with a deep, resonant thud that echoed briefly in the still air before the door was opened by the same steward who had visited the workshop. The steward recognized them immediately and stepped aside to let them enter, closing the door behind them with a solid thump that cut off the cold as suddenly as a snuffed candle. The interior of the boyar's house was warm and dim, lit by oil lamps and the glow of a large tile stove that stood in the corner of the entrance hall, its surface painted with blue and yellow patterns that danced in the flickering light. The walls were hung with tapestries showing scenes of forests and rivers, and in a nearby room, visible through an open doorway, a row of icons gleamed with the soft, dark richness of old gold. The steward led Ivan and Misha into a larger chamber where the boyar himself stood waiting, a broad man with a grey beard that fell to his chest and shoulders that spoke of a life spent in council chambers rather than in physical labor. His clothing was simple but fine, a long kaftan of dark wool, leather boots polished to a soft sheen, and a sash of embroidered silk at his waist, and his face, though lined with age, held a calm and patient expression that was not unkind. Misha stepped forward and placed the linen-wrapped bundle on a long wooden table that stood in the center of the room, then retreated to stand near the wall while Ivan approached and began to untie the twine. The steward and the boyar watched in silence as the wrapping cloth fell open and the cloak was revealed, still folded with the fur inward so that its full glory was not yet visible. Ivan lifted the garment with both hands and, in a single smooth motion, shook it gently to unfurl the folds, then held it up by the collar for the boyar to inspect. The sable caught the light of the oil lamps and seemed to come alive, the dark fur gleaming and the silver tips shimmering, and the standing collar rose proud and straight, while the sleeves fell in their smooth, tapered lines, and the horn toggles glowed with their warm, organic luster. The boyar took a step closer, his hands clasped behind his back, and studied the cloak without speaking. His eyes moved slowly from the collar down to the hem and back up again, lingering on the shoulders where the seams were invisible and the nap flowed in an unbroken cascade, and then he reached out and ran his hand over the fur with a touch that was surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. He felt the density of the underwool and the silkiness of the guard hairs, and his palm traveled across the back and down one sleeve, testing the weight and the warmth. He lifted the front edge to examine the indigo lining, noted the neatness of the catch stitches, and then closed the cloak, and fastened the top toggle through its braided leather loop, watching how easily the horn seated itself. A small sound of approval came from deep in his throat, barely audible, and he nodded once to Ivan with a look of quiet satisfaction. The boyar then lifted the cloak and settled it over his own shoulders, the garment draped around him as if it had been made for no one else, which of course it had, the weight of the sable falling evenly across his broad back and the collar rising to shield his neck while the front panels closed over his chest without gaping or pulling. He fastened the remaining toggles one by one, his thick fingers managing the task without difficulty, and then he walked a few steps across the room, the cloak swinging gently with his movement and the fur catching the lamplight in a soft, dark shimmer. The steward watched with an expression of professional approval, and even Misha, who had seen the cloak every day of its making, seemed struck by how well it suited the man for whom it had been intended. After a moment the boyar returned to the table and unfastened the toggles, laying the cloak down with the same care Ivan had used when handling it. What followed was a simple exchange, conducted without ceremony. The steward produced a leather pouch from a chest in the corner and counted out a number of silver coins onto the table, stacking them in neat piles, while Ivan watched in silence and then swept the coins into his own smaller pouch, which he tucked inside his coat. The boyar's wife, a woman with a kind face and a woolen shawl drawn over her hair, entered the room and added to the payment a small bundle wrapped in a clean cloth, a loaf of fine white bread, a round of soft cheese, and a handful of dried figs that had come from far southern orchards. She pressed the bundle into Misha's hands with a warm smile, and the boy accepted it with a duck of his head and a murmured word of thanks. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate gratitude, only the quiet completion of a transaction between people who understood the value of good work and honest payment. The steward escorted them back to the entrance hall, and Ivan and Misha put on their outer garments, while the warmth of the house slowly gave way to the anticipation of the cold outside. The steward opened the heavy oak door, and the frozen air rushed in, but it no longer felt as harsh as it had on the walk over. Perhaps the warmth of the boyar's hearth still clung to their clothes, or perhaps the satisfaction of a task completed had made the cold easier to bear. Ivan nodded farewell to the steward, and then he and Misha stepped out into the pearl-grey afternoon and began the walk back to the workshop. The streets were as quiet as before, but something in the quality of the silence had shifted. The frost still held the city in its grip, the snow still lay thick on the roofs and the river, and the distant figures still moved slowly through the pale light. But the weight of the undone work that had pressed on Ivan's shoulders for so many days had lifted, and the cold felt cleaner and less oppressive. Misha walked beside him with the bundle of bread and cheese and figs tucked under his arm, and though neither of them spoke, the silence between them was comfortable, the silence of shared labor brought to its natural end. They arrived back at the workshop in the early afternoon, and Ivan pushed open the door to find the stove still glowing with the embers of the morning's fire. He added a fresh log and stood before the warmth, while Misha set the food bundle on the table and unwrapped it, breaking off a piece of the white bread and handing it to Ivan, then taking a small piece for himself. The bread was soft and fine, a luxury compared to the dense black loaves they usually ate, and the figs were sweet and chewy and tasted of sunshine and distant lands. They ate in their accustomed silence, the simple meal a quiet celebration that required no words. After they had eaten and tidied the crumbs away, Ivan set about returning the workshop to its ordinary state. The felt tool roll was unrolled and inspected, each needle wiped with a drop of oil and returned to its pocket, the round knife and the smaller blades given the same treatment, the bone folder polished with a scrap of wool until it gleamed. The beeswax block was set back on its shelf, the remaining spools of thread coiled and stored, the charcoal sticks placed in their clay cup, and the measure cord wound into a neat loop and hung from its hook. The scraps of sable that still remained, the smallest offcuts, the narrow ribbons, the tiny triangles that were too small even for practice, were gathered into a basket that Ivan placed near Misha's stool, a final gift of material for the boy to use as he continued learning the craft. Misha took up the basket and sat on his stool, turning the scraps over in his hands and sorting them by size and fur direction, a small echo of the very first day when Ivan had done the same with the 72 whole pelts. He selected a piece of leather with a particularly fine silver tipping and a needle with a length of practice thread, and he began to sew a small, careful seam along its edge, his stitches still uneven but steadier than they had been at the beginning of the project, his hands already learning the rhythm that would carry him through a lifetime of work. Ivan watched the boy for a moment, then turned and walked to the large wooden peg where the cloak had hung for so many days. The peg was empty now, just a smooth cylinder of birch wood protruding from the log wall, its surface worn dark from years of holding heavy garments. He touched it once with his palm, a brief private gesture, and then he crossed to the window where the frost still obscured the glass in a thick white sheet. He did not rub a circle in it this time. He simply stood and looked at the whiteness, his reflection a dark shape in the pale glow, and his thoughts were his own. The afternoon faded into evening with the same gradual dimming of the light that had marked every day in the workshop, and Ivan lit the 2 oil lamps while Misha fed the stove with a fresh birch log. The flames caught and rose, and the warmth filled the room, and the two of them sat together in the amber glow, while the winter darkness pressed against the frosted window. The basket of scraps sat on the floor near Misha's stool. The tools lay clean and ready in their felt roll, and the empty peg on the wall cast a long shadow that wavered gently in the lamplight. Outside, the great frost of 1708 continued its long, silent reign over Moscow, and the snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down from the pearl-grey sky to add new layers to the frozen city. Inside the workshop on Varvaka Street, the stove glowed, the lamp burned, and the quiet rhythm of patient craft and rest filled the small room with a peace that was deeper than sleep, a peace as warm and enduring as the sable cloak that now belonged to the boyar and would shield him from the cold for many winters to come.